Hey everyone, welcome back. If possible, you can support me via PayPal or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 1051. You can become senior brother. Chen Pingan put away his talismanic boat as he landed on the city wall. Whether intentionally or not, Zuyu restrained his sword chi. There were only 10 paces between the two of them. Zuyu opened his eyes and looked at the vast world beyond the city wall, asking, "Have you thought about some matters that are certain to happen?" Located to the north of the Sword Chi Great Wall, that city with profoundly deep foundations and secrets exuded a sense of strict rules, yet it also appeared lawless at the same time. There was a sword immortal who killed countless enemies in battle, yet he would live like a mortal emperor, indulging in drinks and dreams during the breaks in battle. There was even an intercontinental ship that was especially used to traffic female chi refiners from this continent, with those that suited the sword immortal's taste being accepted into the extravagant palace to work as maidservants, and those that didn't suit the sword immortal's taste being beheaded by his flying sword. Even so, the sword immortal would still pay for the unsatisfactory goods. There was a sword immortal who liked to look after some small vegetable fields and an orchard, living as a farmer year after year. There was a sword immortal who liked to wander around the markets, using an illusion technique as he hung out with the delinquents in the alleys all year round. There were descendants of large clans who yearned to leave the Sword Chi Great Wall to seek knowledge in the Confucian schools and academies, and there were also young masters from wealthy clans who were unrestrained and eccentric, willing to spend lavishly but also finding joy in brutally killing their servants. The previous Confucian sage overseeing the Sword Chi Great Wall had complained about this phenomenon, but old great sword immortal Chan Qingdu had simply stated that they could talk after a fight. And thus, the Confucian sage had engaged in 3 battles in a row, winning 2 and losing 1. Following this, he had left the Sword Chi Great Wall in despondence and returned to the majestic world. He had defeated 2 local sword immortals but had lost to the Lord Hidden Official. The rights and wrongs involved weren't as simple as he had imagined, so you could clearly detect the overwhelming killing intent even when he had simply heard about this matter afterward. When it came to worldly matters, the most frightening thing was not having a firm position, which led to utter confusion between right and wrong. At the same time, the most frightening thing was stubbornly maintaining one's position, treating everything as black and white. Zuyu was most afraid of those smart people who didn't speak reason and only believed in taking sides. Are these matters distant or near? Chen Pingan asked. Zuyu pushed aside his disorderly thoughts and replied, "They're matters in the city, right beside us and right in front of our eyes." Chen Pingan nodded and said, "Senior brother, you reminded me before, and I'm also aware of the environment in the city. People speak without restraint, so it won't be long before dark undercurrents sweep through the city, with gossip and rumors gradually rising to the fore. Me winning 4 battles in a row is a reason, me staying at the Ning residence is a reason, and me being the scholarly sage's disciple and your junior brother is also a reason. Things have only been delayed due to old sword immortal Dong and the other sword immortals visiting Dai Zhang's wine shop to enjoy a drink, forcing many people to shut their mouths and swallow the words that were already on the tips of their tongues. Let's focus on the results," Zuyu said. "Many people are afraid of the matters pertaining to the Ning residence being brought up again, so they're not very willing to see the relationship between the Ning residence and the Yao clan return to an amicable state," Chen Pingan said. "With my presence, the initially pure relationship between Ning Yao, Chan Sanqiu, Dong Huafu, and Yin Zhuo will become extremely murky in the eyes of some people. Perhaps they didn't care in the past, but they'll be quite displeased now. We might have to include the Guo clan as well, so the situation will become even more complicated afterward. It's very likely that Guo Zhuzhou will be grounded and forced to stay home in the near future, because it won't be long before some grating comments reach the ears of the Guo clan. For example, the Guo clan is very good at forging relationships for their own benefit, and the sword immortal of the clan has even sent a young girl over to build this relationship. Regardless of what people say, there can only be a single outcome, that being the Guo clan temporarily distancing themselves from the Ning residence. The Guo clan is larger than just sword immortal Guo, and the 100 or so people in the clan still need to make a living at the Sword Chi Great Wall. These outcomes were still acceptable, and Chen Pingan was actually afraid that people would become even more ruthless and debauched. For example, orchestrating the sudden death of a child from the impoverished alleys near the new wine shop. However, he didn't voice this fear to Zui Yu. This is unless Chen Qingdu personally comes forward and helps you propose marriage to the Ning residents, Zui Yu said. Chen Pingan nodded in response. Why aren't you in a rush? Zui Yu asked. I neither dare to nor am I willing to rush the old great sword immortal. In any case, I have plans for both cases, whether this proposal happens earlier or later, Chen Pingan replied. Care to explain? Zui Yu asked. They're only words, so I won't concern myself with them. It's not like I'll be able to suppress them anyway. If they get physical, then I have my fists and my swords. If these aren't enough, then I'll borrow more from you, senior brother, Chen Pingan replied. Zui Yu nodded, and a smile played on his lips as he said, Not bad. I can't be bothered asking about your specific plan, so you can think it through carefully on your own. The unexpected surprises at the Sword Qi Great Wall are often surprisingly simple and direct, making them appear even more unexpected. Do you know how many sword cultivators from the Sword Qi Great Wall are tempering their sword Dao in the savage world right now? I'm not privy to such top-level secrets, Chen Pingan replied with a shake of his head. Then what are you privy to? Zui Yu asked with a smile. I know the names and the rough backgrounds of the upper 5-tier sword immortals as well as the earth immortal sword cultivators of the Sword Qi Great Wall, Chen Pingan replied. I also know about 121 important individuals belonging to the Dong, Chan, Qi, and a dozen or so other clans. This information isn't significant, but something is better than nothing. You have this much spare time? Zui Yu asked in puzzlement. This is a habit that has become second nature, and I'm relatively familiar with these matters to begin with. Rest assured, senior brother, this definitely won't affect my cultivation and my fist technique training. You fancy commercialism and foretellers? Zui Yu asked. Chen Pingan faltered for a moment before shaking his head and replying, I've never come into contact with the scriptures and tenets of these two schools of thought. Zui Yu shot a glance at Chen Pingan and chuckled. Even though the teachings of these two schools of thought languish at the bottom of the many teachings and schools of thought, having also been rejected and looked down on by the Confucian sect for a long time, I feel like it shouldn't be a problem for you to peruse some of their works. However, you shouldn't become too stuck in them. Many principles in the world appear especially breathtaking to begin with, yet they're actually basic and shallow in the long run. Many principles appear vast and boundless at first glance, yet they're actually covered in large patches of weeds. You'll feel like these principles are only so after you gain a full understanding of them, but it's still important to read and study them first. The main thing to watch out for is being able to accept these principles but not being able to spit them back out. Anyhow, being able to obtain a fundamental principle from a sagely scripture of the 100 schools of thought would be a huge gain. Chen Pingan cupped his fists and bowed in respect, saying, Thank you for enlightening me. Zui Yu stood up and said, Sword immortals generally won't use immortal observation techniques to keep an eye on the movements in the city, unless they're observing battles taking place in the city to the north. This is an unwritten rule. There are some matters you need to resolve by yourself, and also bear the responsibility alone. However, there is one matter where I can help you take a few extra glances. Which matter do you think this is? Which matter do you hope it is? I hope senior brother can keep an eye on the children living in the streets and alleys near the wine shop, making sure they don't die because of me, Chen Pingan replied without hesitation. Zui Yu didn't offer a response, instead asking, Isn't this a most minor matter? Is it worth my attention? There are no small matters in the eyes of scholars, Chen Pingan replied with a smile. Zui Yu sighed with emotion. Chen Pingan, it would have been quite good if you had become Master's disciple earlier. Master wouldn't have felt frustrated and anxious for 100 years, and you could have taken my position to look after Master's finances and chat with him. I'm not good at either of these things. Chen Pingan adamantly refused to comment on such remarks. When Master became a sage back then, there were still some people who criticized him for being a sly old scholar, saying that he was seemingly like a fox that had cultivated into a spirit. Moreover, they claimed that Master's cultivation base was drawn from a vat of ink. When Master heard this, he simply commented, How wonderful! Zui Yu suddenly revealed. The citizens of the Great Sui nation were furious after the emperor of their nation signed a mountain alliance with the Great Li Empire, and some of them insulted senior brother Mao and accused him of being a scholastic parasite. Chen Pingan said. Looking back now, senior brother Mao most likely felt happy at the time. Zuyu didn't say anything else. Chen Pingan also fell silent. He was trying to delay the sword technique training as much as possible. After all, there was no doubt that he would train until he could barely move anymore. He suddenly wanted to say something, but he couldn't help but hesitate. He turned his gaze towards Zuyu. Zuyu nodded in response, gesturing for Chen Pingan to speak freely. Chen Pingan used his mind's lake to ask, "Senior brother, might there be sword immortals in the city secretly spying on the Ning residents?" Zuyu thought for a moment before replying. Even if there are, they won't be spying continuously or long-term. They'll only be spying occasionally. Nalan Yeshing isn't a powerless decoration after all, and not only is he a masterful assassin, but he's also one of the most underestimated sword cultivators at the Sword Chi Great Wall. Since he's a capable assassin, he's naturally skilled at concealment and investigation as well. Chen Pingan's expression was solemn as he revealed, "Regarding the 18 stops technique that Aoyang taught me, not only did I teach it to my disciple Pei Qian, but I also taught it to an ordinary young boy in the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, a boy by the name Zhao Gaoshu. His character is exemplary, and there are definitely no issues there. However, Zhao Gaoshu has yet to make his way to Downtrodden Mountain, so I'm worried that, what if? I'll deal with this matter," Zuyu said. Chen Pingan breathed a sigh of relief. Having a senior brother around indeed made things a little different. "We've discussed many things, but none of these are reasons for you to delay your sword technique training," Zuyu added. Chen Pingan was rendered speechless. Even that bastard Wei Jin screwing him over couldn't be viewed as a legitimate reason. With senior brother Zuyu's temperament, he most certainly wouldn't regard this as an acceptable excuse. If Chen Pingan tried to use this excuse, he would only end up suffering more when he practiced sword techniques in a bit. Perhaps people couldn't understand the reasoning behind this unless they were from the scholarly sage's lineage. Zuyu sat back on the parapet, unmoving as he continued to nurture his sword intent. "How should I practice sword techniques?" Chen Pingan asked in an uncertain voice. "What, do you think you're unparalleled just because you're a Vajrabhati tier martial artist? Do you need me to draw my sword first?" Zuyu scoffed. Chen Pingan understood Zuyu's message, and he asked in a careful voice, "Then I'll launch a punch now?" Zuyu completely ignored his question. Chen Pingan was a little hesitant about whether he should use the deity drumming technique for his first punch. If you can advance 30 paces within 100 punches, also allowing cooperation from your flying swords, then I'll call you senior brother in the future, Zuyu unexpectedly said in a slow voice. He no longer restrained his sword intent, allowing it to seemingly expand outward like a small world. Chen Pingan was instantly pushed back 20 paces. No more and no less, there were exactly 30 paces between Zuyu and Chen Pingan. Sword intent rushed over, appearing like countless tangible flying swords sweeping through the air. If it weren't for Chen Pingan's fist aura naturally pouring outward and blocking the countless wisps of sword intent seeping from Zuyu's sword chi, it was very likely that he would have already been riddled with wounds at this moment. Chen Pingan was forced to retreat several steps, yet his fist intent soared to great heights as he stepped back. "If I feel like you're holding back after 100 punches, then you can get ready to complain the next time you see Master," Zuyu commented with a faint smile. Chen Pingan squeezed out a smile and said, "I'm not that kind of person, senior brother. After the training sessions you'll become that kind of person even if you aren't," Zuyu said. Wei Jin who was drinking and Wei Jin who wasn't drinking were two completely different people. Wei Jin who was drinking a few sips and Wei Jin who was gulping down a few pots were again two completely different people. He was the first young sword immortal from the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent to travel to the Sword Chi Great Wall in 1,000 years, and he was actually very welcomed and popular here, especially among the women. Young women wouldn't necessarily admire Wei Jin, seeing that there were many sword immortals in their hometown to begin with. Even though Wei Jin was extremely young, with people saying that he had already become an upper 5-tier sword immortal at 40 years old, this wasn't too rare or surprising at the Sword Chi Great Wall. Wei Jin was even less special when it came to the destructive ability of his flying sword, at least right now, given that he was only at the unpolished Jade tier. In terms of looks, men from the Qi clan were renowned for being handsome, so Wei Jin couldn't be regarded as the most outstanding in this regard either. The men in Chan Sancho's clan were also quite handsome. However, the slightly older women all took a liking to Wei Jin as if in tacit understanding, saying that Wei Jin drew their sympathy when he drank. Wei Jin looked eternally anxious when he didn't drink, but a warm smile would appear on his face after 2 or 3 cups of wine. His demeanor would further become lively and spirited after several pots of wine. Thus, to the women who had seen Wei Jin drinking before, this young sword immortal from Wind Snow Temple's divine platform truly appeared like an immortal who had walked out from the wind and snow. Just what kind of woman was lingering in Wei Jin's mind, so difficult for him to let go of? The heartless Aoyang had left, but the love-struck Wei Jin had now arrived. The heavens were quite fair to them. As for Zuoyu, they could forget about him. Just taking a few extra glances at him would make their eyes hurt, so why torture themselves for no reason? In any case, Zuoyu didn't like to stroll around the city either, and looking at him from afar made him appear hazy and distant. At the end of the day, he didn't elicit as much emotion and care as Wei Jin, who often visited the city to drink, did he? Wei Jin wouldn't suppress the alcohol when he became drunk, and he would instead remain inebriated as he shakily flew back to the city wall on his sword, cutting a despondent figure that drew sympathy and pity. Squeezed at a table of a dozen or so people, Wei Jin became slightly drunk at Dai Zhang's wine shop today. Wei Jin had one good habit when he drank. He never became egotistical. If there were no free seats, he wouldn't mind even if he had to sit on the same bench as 2 or 3 other people. Perhaps this was the charisma unique to those who had traveled extensively through the martial world. Regarding this, Wei Jin indeed possessed the natural demeanor of someone from the martial world, an aura that couldn't be matched by the local sword immortals, nor by the sword cultivators from the other continents. Wei Jin had first met Chen Pingan when the latter was still a young boy, and he hadn't liked or disliked him to begin with. Now, however, he appreciated Chen Pingan a little more. However, Wei Jin couldn't bring himself to not like He Xiaoyang. The further apart they were, the more Wei Jin would drink. He tried to hide outside the mountains and he tried to hide in the martial world, but he was still unable to forget her no matter what. In the beginning, he was at the Wind Snow Temple, and she was at the Divine Edict sect. Afterward, he was at the Eastern Treasured Vial continent, and she was at the Northern Complete Reed continent. And now, he was in the godforsaken savage world and she was in the majestic world. However, she still lingered in Wei Jin's wine cup, refusing to dissipate no matter how much wine he drank, finishing 1 cup of wine and pouring himself another. Her rippling figure would once again appear atop the wine. Wei Jin raised his wine cup and asked in a loud voice, "Why is it difficult for those who dislike drinking to get drunk?" He then downed the wine in a single gulp and lamented, "The person who invented wine is truly detestable. Absolutely reprehensible." Dai Zhang had already grown accustomed to this. Sword immortal Wei Jin would often act like this when he drank, and even though he muttered to himself a lot, he would never truly go on a drunken rampage. Otherwise, how could a small wine shop like hers withstand the crazed behavior of a sword immortal? There was no one calling out for Dai Zhang to add wine at the moment, so she seized this rare opportunity to take a rest, sitting on the door threshold and heaving a soft sigh. He was at it again. Wei Jin stood still and poured cup after cup of wine, after which he looked around and started to toast the other customers, one after another. He addressed all of them by name, explaining why he was toasting them after they shared a drink. This naturally pertained to their feats in battle to the south of the city wall, for example, which of their sword strikes was truly magnificent. Wei Jin would occasionally ask some customers to drink as punishment as well, stating that they had shockingly failed to kill some demons that deserved death, only managing to severely wound them instead. This was unacceptable. Wei Jin suddenly disappeared from the wine shop, shouting in anger, "How despicable!" Guizhuzhou walked unsteadily through a small alley. An emaciated young boy had already run into the alley earlier, with his footsteps frantic as he seemingly hid from someone. He continued to glance back, appearing slightly hesitant when he saw Guizhuzhou. He slowed down a little, subconsciously shuffling closer to the wall. Here at the Sword Qi Great Wall, rich people would only become richer with time, eventually being able to form their own clan. And once their clan produced a sword immortal, they would then become a powerful clan. Of course, this was given that they didn't die. The impoverished residents of the city could easily tell whether or not a person was a descendant of a powerful clan from just their clothes alone. The young boy clearly felt like Guozhuzhou was from a powerful clan, and his assessment was indeed correct. The Guo clan was indeed a first-rate clan of the Sword Qi Great Wall, with its status just below that of the top-notch clans. Offending descendants from these powerful clans would often lead to miserable outcomes, with the descendants seldom needing to take advantage of their background or backers. If they were sword cultivators, they could generally draw their swords and deal with the problems themselves. Guozhuzhou slowed down and skipped a few times, and she saw 4 other children running into the alley behind the young boy. They were holding sticks and clubs, noisy and making a scene as they walked over. The young boy saw that Guozhuzhou didn't appear like a sword cultivator, and she was most likely from a wealthy family on those large streets, only coming here to wander around because she was bored. This caused him to feel slightly anxious, and he frantically waved his hand at Guozhuzhou, gesturing for her to make haste and leave the small alley. Guozhuzhou scratched her head and ground to a halt, after which she turned around and sprinted away. She was good at running away, and she also enjoyed doing so. It was a shame that the young boy was delayed by Guozhuzhou's presence, and he was caught by the 4 stick-wielding children behind him in no time. A stick haphazardly whooshed at the emaciated young boy's head, and he just managed to dodge it by the skin of his teeth. However, another stick cracked down from above, forcing him to block with his hand. He retreated as he defended himself, taking a blow to the arm that caused him to turn pale with pain. This was quickly followed by a kick to the chest from a brawny young boy. The emaciated young boy retreated several steps, with blood seeping from the corners of his mouth as he placed one hand against the wall to steady himself. He tilted his head to the side, dodging another attack before turning around and furiously sprinting away. Guozhuzhou poked her head out from the corner of the alley, feeling like she needed to uphold justice and act in a righteous manner. Otherwise, it looked like someone was going to die today. No one at the Sword Qi Great Wall would care about normal fights and skirmishes, even if someone was crippled as a result. However, someone getting beaten to death was very uncommon. Guozhuzhou had heard from seniors in her clan that those who fought the most ferociously weren't sword immortals, but actually the hot-blooded and impulsive youths in the streets and alleys. This was the case right now, and Guozhuzhou couldn't turn a blind eye to this. She was now learning fist techniques and had essentially become a member of the martial world, so she decided to step forward and re-enter the small alley. The emaciated young boy was struck by another flying kick, and Guozhuzhou placed a steadying hand on his shoulder as he stumbled back. The young boy's expression was indifferent as he suddenly twisted his body and flicked his wrist, thrusting backward as a short blade slid out from his sleeve. Guozhuzhou nimbly raised her elbow, directly snapping the young boy's blade-wielding arm. The young boy instantly clenched his other hand into a fist and unleashed a punch, surprisingly releasing a powerful fist aura that rumbled like thunder. The other children, who had overwhelmed and beaten the emaciated young boy just then, immediately pressed their backs against the alley wall, their faces becoming pale with fright. Guozhuzhou appeared just as calm and indifferent as the emaciated young assassin, and she also responded with a punch of her own, striking the young assassin's fist and causing his bones to shatter. His arms fell limply to his sides, and Guozhuzhou turned her body slightly before charging forward and driving her shoulder into his chest, killing him instantly. The young assassin's corpse collapsed backward, yet a glimmering streak of light rapidly shot past his head, viciously racing toward Guozhuzhou's glabella. This was surprisingly the bonded flying sword of a sword cultivator. Guozhuzhou turned her head slightly, but the deadly flying sword still left a deep and bloody gash in her forehead, so deep that her skull could be seen. Looking further down the alley, however, the brawny young boy who had launched the surprise attack had a bead of blood gradually forming on his forehead, with a small hole running through his entire head. His lifeless body slowly slumped down against the alley wall. Guozhuzhou furrowed her brows as she reached up to touch her forehead. Wei Jin, who was standing at the entrance of the small alley, breathed a sigh of relief as he quietly put away his bonded flying sword. The sword immortal from the Wind Snow Temple didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. As it turned out, his concern and his hasty travel to this small alley were completely unnecessary. Not only was the young girl able to deal with this sudden assassination attempt herself, albeit facing a very close brush with death, but a smiling and hunchbacked old man had also appeared on the other end of the small alley. Wei Jin nodded in respectful acknowledgement, and the old man also smiled and returned the gesture. Wei Jin returned to the wine shop, continuing to drink wine. The old man strode forward and arrived beside Guozhuzhou in a single step, saying with a smile, "Not bad, little Lu Duan." He was none other than Nalin Yexing, the old servant of the Ning residence. Chen Pingan had said before that as long as Guozhuzhou met him or visited the Ning residence, then he would need to trouble Grandpa Nalin with protecting the young girl until she safely returned home to the Guo residence. "Of course," Guozhuzhou replied with a smug expression. "I can't beat Big Sister Ning and Big Sister Dong, but a few measly scoundrels like them?" The young girl walked forward several steps and looked at the emaciated young boy who had died suddenly, yet still maintained a calm and composed expression and grumbled, "Don't you know that I just started to learn a peerless fist technique?" Nalin Yexing reached up and tapped his forehead. This was giving him a headache. When it came to meticulously planned assassination attempts targeting the descendants of large clans, people didn't need to dream about finding clues and traces to uncover the main culprit. This wouldn't be possible. Just how big had the commotion at Mirage Market been back then? The foundation of Ningyao's Great Dao was almost damaged, and Bai Lianshuang had also suffered a decline in her cultivation base. Because of this, even Chan Qingdu, who resided on the city wall and seldom paid any heed to the matters of the Sword Qi Great Wall, was enraged, personally issuing a command and directly summoning the clan leader of the Chan clan, wounding him with a single sword strike. The wounded clan leader had then hurriedly returned to the city, going all out and placing the entire city under martial law, searching each and every house for clues. Mirage Market had naturally been turned upside down in a thorough search as well. But what was the final outcome? No clues were found, and the investigation eventually went nowhere. Moreover, this hadn't been caused by people hindering the investigation on purpose. No one had dared to do this, but rather they had genuinely failed to find a single clue or trace. As for the stupefied and petrified youths dragged into this mess, their identities and backgrounds would still be investigated as part of the process. Nothing would come of this, and it would simply be a means to appease the Guo clan. Of course, the Guo clan would definitely wield their power and use their relationships to perform a thorough investigation. Afterward, the relationship between the Ning clan and the Guo clan would face some difficulties. Theoretically speaking, little Lu Duan should have been able to run around the Sword Qi Great Wall to her heart's content. The reason for this was very simple. The Lord Hidden Official had once viewed her as a disciple. Thus, the Guo clan hadn't explicitly arranged any sword cultivator guards for her these past few years. There hadn't been any need to. Because of this, there was a lot to ruminate over regarding the ripple effects of this assassination attempt, as well as the level of the assassins. It felt like the people behind this attempt were okay with little Lu Duan being killed or not, so they hadn't used any of their critical go pieces. Guozhuzhou frowned in worry, appearing defeated and listless as she groaned, "I'm done for. I won't be able to leave home for a long time." However, her eyes immediately lit up as she turned to Nalin Yexing and suggested, "Why don't we destroy the corpses and wipe away the evidence, Grandpa Nalin? We can pretend that this never happened, right?" Nalin Yexing smiled and replied, "You're kidding yourself. How are you going to hide the deep gash on your forehead? Perhaps you tripped over and fell while walking again? In any case, Sword Immortal Guo should be made aware of such a major incident, so I've already sent a messenger flying sword to your clan. Which is to say, you can prepare to get scolded." Guozhuzhou sighed in grief and lamented, "Grandpa Nalin, you have to make sure to deliver this message to my master. Tell master that I can't learn fist techniques from him for a while." Nalin Yexing smiled and asked, "When did he ever acknowledge you as a disciple?" Guozhuzhou grinned and replied, "It's simply a matter of master performing some calculations on his fingers." Nalin Yexing pointed at the young girl's forehead. "'Tis but a scratch," Guozhuzhou remarked with a scoff. She then shivered before putting on a sullen expression and exclaiming, "Ouch! It hurts." A tall and slender middle-aged sword immortal arrived in the small alley in a flash, standing beside Guozhuzhou and bending down. He lowered his head and placed a finger on her head, gently pushing it around to gauge his daughter's injuries. He breathed a sigh of relief, determining that the remnant sword qi in the gash wouldn't cause any serious issues. After standing up, he smiled and asked, "Are you still going to recklessly run around now?" Guozhuzhou put up one hand. "Grounded for 5 years? Sword Immortal Guojia asked with a chuckle. 5 hours. Actually, just make that 5 days, Guozhujiu replied in a timid voice. The smile disappeared from Guojia's face. Seeing that things were going south, Guozhujiu hurriedly put down 4 fingers, only keeping her thumb raised as she shouted, 1 year. Guojia glanced at his daughter's wound and said in exasperation, Hurry up and come home with me. Your mother's worried to death. As for whether you'll be grounded for 1 year or several years, trying to bargain with me won't mean anything. You can cry and throw a tantrum in front of your mother. In the end, Guojia and Nailan Yeshing exchanged a glance, not needing to say anything to achieve mutual understanding. Afterward, guest elders from the Guo clan, as well as sword cultivators who specialized in dealing with these matters, quickly arrived at the crime scene and adeptly carried out their tasks. Nailan Yeshing didn't return to the Ning residence straight away, and he instead made his way to the Sword Qi Great Wall first. Even if he went back to the Ning residence, Bai Lianshuang wasn't good at dealing with these matters, so she would only feel helpless, worried, and angry upon hearing his recount. It would definitely be beneficial to discuss this incident with young mistress, especially given that she was already the one making all of the major decisions these past few years. However, now that Chen Pingan was staying at the Ning residence, Nailan Yeshing didn't want young mistress to focus too much of her effort on these dirty matters. Meanwhile, Chen Pingan was least afraid of troublesome matters and most prone to overthinking things, and in any case, young mistress would definitely support Chen Pingan's decisions. Nailan Yeshing concealed his aura and stealthily made his way to the city wall. He observed the commotion over there. Was this any way to practice sword techniques and fist techniques? Yet, Chen Pingan did the same thing again and again, continuing to use the deity drumming technique and also controlling 4 flying swords in total, 2 genuine and 2 replicas. He tried his best to find gaps in Zhuoyu's sword qi, seemingly striving to advance even a single step. He once again needed to use the flesh-regenerating spirit pills of the Ning residence. Thankfully, Bai Lianshuang couldn't blame Nailan Yeshing for Chen Pingan's wounds this time. Sword qi was gathered in a radius of 30 paces around Zhuoyu, but a wisp would occasionally dash out and hover beside one of Chen Pingan's critical acupoints for a brief moment, after which it would quickly dissipate. Nailan Yeshing couldn't help but sigh with emotion and remark, We're all humans, so can he possibly possess so much sword qi? Moreover, he's almost tempered all of this sword qi into sword intent. Zhuoyu paid no heed to the old man, retracting his sword qi to within 10 paces before saying to Chen Pingan, We'll call it a day here. Your punches are acceptable, but your sword strikes are rigid and slow. Today was just for you to familiarize yourself, and the next time you attend training is when we'll officially begin. Also, you essentially died 96 times today, so you can aim to die less next time. Zhuoyu sighed. Is it really this difficult to be a readily available senior brother? Chen Pingan remained silent and nodded in response. Zhuoyu had the gall to ask him whether it was difficult or not. Was senior brother Zhuoyu not aware of just how heavy and abundant his sword qi was? Apart from his fists and arms, it appeared as if Chen Pingan was completely fine at this moment, with no damage to his acupoints as a qi refiner. In reality, however, this wasn't the case at all. Every time a wisp of sword qi stopped beside Chen Pingan, it looked like the sword qi wouldn't make contact with his critical acupoints, but in actual fact, the deadly sword intent would seep into his body and bones, causing absolute chaos in his acupoints. That Chen Pingan was able to speak without a quivering voice at this moment was already a reflection of his impressive pain tolerance. Chen Pingan covered dozens of meters in a few steps, arriving beside Nailan Yeshing and asking in a quiet voice, Did Guozhujiu get hurt? I kept an eye on her the entire time, and I purposely didn't interfere and let the young girl deal with the trouble herself, Nailan Yeshing replied. Her wounds are light, and Guojia personally rushed over and didn't say too much, as is typical of him. However, the troublesome matters that are sure to follow. Chen Pingan put 2 fingers together and lightly swiped downward, seemingly severing a long thread with a sword as he shook his head and replied, These matters aren't troublesome anymore. Rather, they can actually be regarded as beneficial matters for the Ning residents and the Guo clan. I'm 100% going to take Guozhujiu as my disciple now. Chen Pingan summoned a talismanic boat and returned to the city with Nailan Yeshing. Grandpa Nailan, are you able to charge within striking range of my senior brother? Chen Pingan asked in curiosity, Of course I can. Nalan Yeshing replied with a chuckle. And then I'll die right away. Ning Yao didn't say anything when she saw Chen Pingan returning from the city wall, yet Granny Bai felt worried and aggrieved again, pulling Nalan Yeshing aside to ferociously scold him. Nalan Yeshing didn't talk back, accepting his fate. It was rare to see a lofty sword immortal being wronged like this. He drank by himself to wash away his frustration. Chen Pingan was accustomed to applying ointment and medicine to his wounds, and Grandma Bai had already given him the keys to the Ning residence's medicinal room and treasure chamber a long time ago. While walking over to the medicinal room, Chen Pingan told Ning Yao and Grandma Bai about the assassination attempt on Guizhuzhou, also explaining the cause and the eventual outcome. Grandma Bai grumbled that these underhanded people who like to pick on children truly deserved to die. Ning Yao didn't think too much about this, unwilling to dwell on the matter as long as the young girl was okay. Anyhow, Chen Pingan liked to think about these things, so she would let him do all the thinking. Since Ning Yao was accompanying Chen Pingan, Bai Lianshuang didn't get in their way. She hadn't scolded old bastard Nalan enough just then, what with Chen Pingan being present and all, so she was going to find an opportunity to scold him to her heart's content. Chen Pingan made his way to the familiar medicinal room, completely unfazed even though his arms were bloody and mangled, with many bones in his hands exposed. He picked out 3 porcelain bottles, also needing to apply ointments of various colors on his wounds. There were 3 main colors and they needed to be applied in a specific manner. When bandaging his wounds, Chen Pingan was still in the mood to make a joke about himself, saying, "According to the processes of firing pottery in the dragon kills, this is called applying a 3-colored glaze, nothing too expensive or fancy. The emperors of the Great Li Empire seldom used this porcelain, and they would mostly use them as rewards for their meritorious subjects." Going back 2 generations, the old emperor at that time was very fond of a particular type of porcelain, one with azure flowers under the glaze and further underglaze outlines as well as golden flourishes. Those were truly beautiful pieces of porcelain. Of course, the process to make them was incredibly complicated and difficult, and the finished product would also appear slightly too colorful. We never had the opportunity to see the finished products, and I've only seen the broken shards of some subpar products. They were indeed very fancy. In fact, the process to make this porcelain was so complicated that out of the dozens of dragon kills, only old man Yao, who was still young at the time, was able to master the process and successfully make finished products. Chen Pingan was initially afraid that Ning Yao wouldn't like to hear about these trivial matters, but she was unexpectedly listening very intently, which encouraged Chen Pingan to recount some other interesting stories from his time as an apprentice in the dragon kills. Lu Xianyang often dragged me over to the porcelain mountain when I was an apprentice, and he would carefully pick and choose the shattered porcelain pieces as if he were looking over his treasures at home. He could identify the original shapes and purposes of the shattered porcelain, regardless of whether they were new or old, almost as if he had made them himself. Among those who aren't chi refiners, firing pottery is indeed a task that requires talent and aptitude. After becoming a cultivator, however, one's perspective on these mortal matters naturally changes. Whether it's music, Go, calligraphy, or painting, there are far too many blemishes and shortcomings that don't stand up to scrutiny. As the saying goes, becoming a cultivator in the mountains, I awoke first from the grand dream, and thought it all ordinary. Song Jisun's father, the late emperor, was much more elegant and refined in his taste. Our dragon kiln was responsible for producing large porcelain vessels for the imperial court, and based on the unique features of these vessels, apprentices like me would privately make nicknames for them, such as Loachback, Lamp Grassroot, Cat Whisker, and so on. We would also speculate whether the emperor, the wealthiest person in the world, was aware of these nicknames. I've heard that the young emperor has reverted to liking those porcelain products with bold and colorful glazes, although much more muted than what his grandfather liked. How are you able to remember so many things? I can't remember very much, Ning Yao asked with a smile. Why are you insulting me in this roundabout manner? Chen Pingan asked. How did I insult you? Ning Yao asked in utter confusion. Aren't you complaining about my cultivation being unfocused and my advancement being too slow? Chen Pingan replied. Ning Yao lightly flicked a finger toward Chen Pingan's arm and said, You're asking for this punishment. Chen Pingan held his hands inside his opposite sleeves and hurriedly turned around, dodging Ning Yao's finger as he remarked, Normal girls would have already burst into tears upon seeing someone in such a miserable state, but you're the opposite, and you even want to rub salt in the wounds. Ning Yao stopped and asked, "Oh? Am I making you feel upset?" Chen Pingan's expression was calm and composed as he put his feet together and hopped forward, swaying his head around as he said to himself, "How can Ning Yao, the girl whom I like, possibly be a normal girl?" Ning Yao launched a kick at Chen Pingan, who was standing in front of her. He fell forward as he was kicked in the backside, landing on his head and calmly standing still upside down. He gracefully turned around and asked with a chuckle, "Do you want to learn this heaven and earth stance?" Ning Yao slowly walked forward, ignoring his question. Chen Pingan stood still and waited for Ning Yao to catch up to him, after which he continued to walk properly and asked in a quiet voice, "Regarding the group of prodigies who came before you and the others, those innate sword talents who are roughly 50 to 100 years old now, are they very strong? I only saw one of them at Dai Zhang's wine shop, Wang Zongping, a sword cultivator at the peak stage of the nascent tier. I haven't come across any of the others." Ning Yao was in no hurry to answer this question, instead asking, "There are many prodigies in our generation of sword cultivators, the most in the past 1,000 years. This is something that you're already aware of. Out of the 30 or so prodigies, do you know how many remain after the 2 large-scale battles? Including prodigies like Guozhuzhou, who have ascended the city wall before but haven't traveled further south, 24 of the 32 prodigies survived, with 8 falling in battle. Half of them died in the chaotic battles, and among them, the extremely talented Zhang Rong fell victim to a surprise assassination attempt by an unpolished Jade-tier Great Demon. Zhang Rong's guardian sword cultivator was also killed while trying to save him," Chen Pingan responded. Ning Yao looked at Chen Pingan, seemingly not wanting to say anything else. He knew everything already, so what was the point of asking her these questions? She had forgotten many things, so she understood even less than him regarding some of these matters. Looking at the pitiful expression on Chen Pingan's face, however, Ning Yao continued, "I need to cultivate now. We can continue this conversation later. Then I'll visit Grandpa Nalen for a drink," Chen Pingan said. "Whatever makes you happy," Ning Yao replied as she briskly walked away. Chen Pingan hadn't wanted to drink to begin with, but he truly wanted to drink at this moment. "Don't drink too much," Ning Yao said without turning around. Chen Pingan nodded in response. He hadn't wanted to drink a lot to begin with, yet he suddenly wanted to drink more now. After arriving at Nalen Yeshing's residence, Chen Pingan was greeted by the sight of the old man sighing and shaking his head. It wasn't that the wine couldn't wash away his sorrows, but rather, that the old woman had just left after scolding him severely. "Care for a drink?" Nalen Yeshing asked with a smile. Chen Pingan smiled and nodded in response, after which the old man poured him a bowl of wine. However, Nalen Yeshing didn't dare to fill the bowl, seeing that Chen Pingan was still wounded from his training. He was afraid of giving Grandma by another reason to scold him. Chen Pingan's arms were bandaged like dumplings, severely inhibiting his movements. However, he was a lower 5-tier cultivator after all, and he had at least learned some mystical abilities, so he moved the wine bowl with a single thought, dragging it closer to himself. He then replicated Chen Sancho's technique, lowering his head to bite the white bowl and lifting it up, tilting it slightly to take a swig. Nalen Yeshing smiled upon seeing this. This was called conforming to the local customs, a very good sign. "Grandpa Nalen, why isn't this bamboo sea small world wine from our own wine shop?" Chen Pingan grumbled. Nalen Yeshing smiled and replied, "This is what's left in the Ning residence's storage this year. Your grandma Bai will set a limit on how much wine can be consumed at the start of the year, and it isn't long before the new year arrives. There aren't many vats of wine left in the residence, and I'll start to support your business next year. Grandma Bai will also purchase many vats of wine without me needing to say anything. Grandpa Nalen, are you curious about why my progress with the sword Qi 18 stops technique is so slow?" Chen Pingan asked. Nalen Yeshing nodded and replied, "Yes, theoretically speaking, your progress shouldn't be so slow, but if young Master Chen doesn't want to say, then it's not my place to ask. Just like the wine on the table, one of the critical acupoints that my sword Qi travels past once held another item," Chen Pingan explained. "Is it a belonging of some deceased sword immortal, a bonded flying sword, that young master is temporarily storing in his acupoint?" Nailan Yeshing asked in curiosity. It was a wisp of sword chi, Chen Pingan replied with a shake of his head. A wisp of sword chi? Nailan Yeshing asked in astonishment. It's only an extremely, extremely small wisp of sword chi. I can't say any more than this, Chen Pingan replied with a dazzling smile. Zuoyu had told him that he didn't need to watch his words around Nailan Yeshing. Even if sword immortals in the city used immortal observation techniques to spy on the Ning residents, they would still make sure to avoid Nailan Yeshing, an immortal tier cultivator in the past. Nailan Yeshing was astounded, but he didn't ask any additional questions. He raised his wine bowl and said, "That's enough talking. Let's drink some wine." Chen Pingan didn't need to be too polite around Nailan Yeshing, so he didn't worry too much about his posture being inelegant as he drank. Nailan Yeshing naturally didn't care much about this either. Chen Pingan was going to become a family member in the future, so he appeared impressive and pleasant to the eye, no matter how Nailan Yeshing looked at him. His fist techniques were lofty, his swordsmanship was progressing well, his mind was sharp, and his appearance was also handsome. Most importantly, he had also engaged in scholarly studies before, something that was extremely rare at the Sword Chi Great Wall. He and young mistress were truly a match made in heaven, and it was no wonder that Bai Lianshuang was extremely protective of them. While the old man and the young man drank, Ning Yao and Grandma Bai were also sitting together and chatting quietly. Grandma Bai looked at Ning Yao and asked with a smile, "It's a good thing for Chen Pingan to face more hardships and difficulties when practicing sword techniques with his senior brother, so there's no need to feel too worried about him. There aren't many people whom Zuoyu will diligently teach sword techniques to. I've heard that many smart people have tried to approach that great sword immortal, but the proud and haughty Zuoyu has never paid any heed to them. In my view, Zuoyu hasn't simply acknowledged Chen Pingan as a disciple of the scholarly sage, but he's genuinely acknowledged him as his junior brother. This is why he's willing to earnestly teach Chen Pingan sword techniques." Ning Yao shook her head before lying down on the table saying, "This isn't what I'm worried about." Grandma Bai smiled and didn't say anything. Ning Yao sat up and continued, "He's really good at flattering people." "Young mistress doesn't like this?" Grandma Bai asked. "I don't dislike it," Ning Yao replied with a shake of her head. "Is young mistress worried that he'll like someone else?" Grandma Bai asked. "I'm not worried," Ning Yao said with a shake of her head. Grandma Bai finally couldn't help but chuckle and ask, "Do you think that he's changed too much while you're seemingly still standing at the same place as before? Are you afraid that he'll walk ahead of you one day? Perhaps you're not worried about his cultivation base advancing too fast or whatnot, but you're worried that there will be less and less for the two of you to talk about." Grandma Bai hit the nail on the head, causing Ning Yao to lie down on the table again with an adrift expression. She then said in a low voice, "I've never liked to speak from a young age, but he's a complete chatterbox unlike me. I don't know how to respond a lot of the time, so will he eventually feel like I'm a very boring and untalkative person one day? He'll naturally still like me, but will he also become untalkative as a result?" A wide smile stretched across the old woman's face, but she didn't laugh out loud as she asked, "Why doesn't young mistress say these things directly?" "I don't want to talk about it," Ning Yao huffed. "He's so smart, and he always likes to dwell on all kinds of things, so can't he think of this himself? Thankfully you didn't say anything. Otherwise you would have truly wronged Chen Pingan. The minds of women are difficult to read, and Chen Pingan isn't an all-knowing and all-seeing immortal," Grandma Bai said in amusement. Ning Yao nodded in response, with her mood improving ever so slightly. Grandma Bai wasn't worried at all. This was because young mistress' small troubles only existed because she truly liked that young man. Night arrived, and Wei Jin stood beside Zuoyu atop the city wall, drinking a pot of Azure Divine Mountain wine that had been quite difficult to purchase. The wine shop only sold a single pot of this wine each day, meaning that no other sword cultivator was able to enjoy it today. Wei Jin smiled and asked, "Did Chen Pingan mention me screwing him over before practicing sword techniques with you?" Zuoyu shook his head and replied, "That would be asking for a beating. My junior brother wouldn't do something like that." "He's that clever?" Wei Jin asked in helplessness. Zuoyu smiled and said, "Master once told me that one of your sword strikes, as well as my sword strike at the Flood Dragon Trench, both had a significant impact on Chen Pingan." Wei Jin faltered for a moment before nodding and saying, "Some years ago, I acted according to my agreement with Senior Aoyang at the residence of a wedding dress female ghost, with my sword greeting the young Chen Pingan before I did. Zuiyu fell momentarily silent before asking, "Do you feel like you're trapped by romantic feelings and bogged down in mud, making it difficult for your sword intent to become pure, and holding you back from ascending any higher?" "I'm indeed a bit anxious, and this is indeed the truth," Wei Jin replied with a nod. "Then you're wrong. As wrong as can be," Zuiyu remarked with a smile. Wei Jin put away his wine and sat up straight, saying, "I'm willing to accept your guidance, Senior Zua. What's the most important thing for sword cultivators practicing sword techniques?" Zuiyu asked. "There are many answers in my mind, but they're definitely not the answers you want to hear," Wei Jin replied with a shake of his head. Zuiyu raised a hand and feigned holding a sword, saying, "It's people holding swords, so the loftiness of sword techniques and the profundity of sword Dao are both small matters for sword cultivators. Even if you're holding one of the 5 legendary immortal swords, you're ultimately the wielder of the sword regardless of your current cultivation base, and regardless of whether you're a sword immortal." Zuiyu put his hand down and turned around to face Wei Jin, continuing, "If you can't unleash your sword because you like a woman, then just what kind of sword immortal are you? You, Wei Jin, have only advanced to the unpolished jade tier because of your strong aptitude for learning sword techniques. But you won't be able to rely on your aptitude and talent alone to ascend to greater heights. I dare say that your achievements will ultimately be very mediocre if you fail to overcome this mental hurdle. If that's the case, you'll do well to speak less with me in the future." Wei Jin took a large swig of wine and murmured, "But I still feel like the lasting affection between lovers is greater than the lasting power of sword qi. I'm not willing to sever this part of me, much less throw it away. For me, thinking of a person and drinking wine in a confused state, like a person trapped in a maze, is better than forgetting about this person and drinking less wine, carrying a sword, and ascending to greater heights." "Then you can't be saved," Zuiyu said with a shake of his head. "Then, Senior, am I unable to chat casually with you in the future?" Wei Jin asked in an uncertain voice. Zuiyu smiled and replied, "Sword immortal Wei Jin should piss off as soon as possible, but alcoholic Wei Jin is welcome to visit often." Wei Jin laughed heartily and drank a large swig of wine, and he was just about to ask Zuiyu a question regarding the 4 immortal swords of the 4 worlds. This was common knowledge, so why had Zuiyu mentioned 5 immortal swords? The Taoist second disciple from the heavenly world, the great heavenly master from the Middle-earth divine continents Mount Longhu, and the scholar regarded as the proudest in the world all possessed an immortal sword. Apart from these 3, it was said that the sword-suppressing pagoda, one of the 9 mighty suppressing pagodas in the majestic world, was suppressing the last of the 4 immortal swords. The 4 worlds were boundlessly large, yet there still didn't exist many celestial weapons. Of course, there wasn't a small number either. However, over the past tens of thousands of years, only 4 swords had the right to be called immortal swords. There definitely wasn't a 5th immortal sword. Before Wei Jin could finish drinking and ask this question, however, he had already left the city wall. This was because the old great sword immortal had arrived. Wei Jin jumped off the parapet before paying his respects and taking his leave. "Are you very surprised to have such a junior brother?" Chen Qingdu stood beside the parapet and asked. Zuiyu remained silent and nodded in response. The ordinary young boy who had learned the sword Qi 18 stops technique, Zhao Gaoshu. This was what Chen Pingan had told Zuiyu inside the isolated small world formed by the latter's sword Qi. In reality, Chen Pingan had also used his mind's lake to say another name, Zhao Shuxia. He was still very young, yet he was already cautious to such a degree, so cautious that even Zuiyu was slightly astonished. Chen Qingdu didn't pay any attention to sword immortals Zuyu's potential act of disrespect, where he simply nodded and chose to remain silent. If he couldn't even tolerate the pride and haughtiness of Zuiyu, then just how many sword immortals on the city wall, and in the city to the north could survive the fury of his sword? Meanwhile, Zuiyu wasn't surprised by Chen Qingdu's knowledge of this matter. Chen Qingdu was essentially peerless on this city wall, and he was perhaps only slightly weaker than the paramount sage in the scholarly temple, the Tao ancestor at the White Jade capital, and Buddha on his lotus platform. This was what caused Zuiyu to feel the most exasperated. At the same time, however, this was also what Zuiyu admired most about the old man. The savage world had assaulted the sword Qi Great Wall for 10,000 years, So how is the city wall still standing strong? All of the great demons in the savage world were keenly aware that as long as Chen Qingdu was still alive, then they wouldn't be able to reach Stalactite Mountain or the majestic world even if the entire Sword Qi Great Wall were destroyed. Only Chen Qingdu was able to suppress the unruly sword cultivators to the north of the Sword Qi Great Wall for 10,000 years. Only this old man could say to the hidden official, "I'm only tolerating you because of your young age. When all of the big and small troubles in the city are resolved, tell Chen Pingan to come here and settle down near the thatched cottage," Chen Qingdu said. "One needs to be focused when practicing the sword, and whenever he becomes a legitimate sword cultivator is when I'll leave the city wall to help him ask for marriage. Otherwise, I don't have the face to make such a request. This is asking an old great sword immortal to make an exception, so all of the wine in a wine shop and a small private school won't suffice as payment. This is up to him. If you won't go to the Yao clan at that time, then I'll go," Zuiyu said. Chen Qingdu smiled and said, "That's not very good. Neither your master nor your junior brother would say something like this if they were present." Zuiyu frowned and asked, "You're also keeping an eye on those children near the wine shop? There are so many things that Chen Qingdu doesn't care about, but you actually care about this." "Otherwise?" Chen Qingdu asked in response. "My sword skills are superior to yours, my sword intent is loftier than yours, and my knowledge is also greater than yours. Even you're able to care about them, so why can't I take a few extra glances? I've already put up with you 2 times, Zuiyu said without expression. "Your greatest strength, your sword qi, is still inferior to others, so just obediently put up with things," Chen Qingdu said with a faint smile. "That's the 3rd time," Zuiyu said with a cold chuckle. "Do you know why I'm willing to look at those children learning characters?" Chen Qingdu asked. Zuiyu appeared indifferent as he replied, "This pertains to one of the biggest problems of the Sword Qi Great Wall. The sword cultivators here have wielded their swords and slain enemies for 10,000 years, and an increasing number of people no longer understand the purpose of their lives and the reason for their deaths." Chen Qingdu nodded and looked toward the lights illuminating the city to the north. The lights at the wealthy clans were dazzling and as bright as day, while the lights at the impoverished alleys were extremely dim and sparse, with large swathes of the alleys being covered in darkness. It's still relatively easy to explain the purpose and reason for life and death, especially given the selfish nature of people. It's very difficult to have people truly think any deeper. Chen Qingdu's expression was forlorn as he continued, "I always hoped that someone over there would act themselves, think themselves and feel for themselves. I hoped that they would understand the cause and the effects, all of the history, as well as the sacrifices made by those past and present. I hoped that despite this knowledge, they could still galvanize the sword cultivators and have them wield their swords and charge south, willing to lay down their lives even if they felt resentment, grief, and fury." The old man slowly raised a hand and said, "There was first a single speck of light in the human world. From 1 came 2, from 2 came 3, and from 3 came the dazzling expanse of stars. It's too late. It's already a lost cause," Zuiyu said with a shake of his head. Chen Qingdu smiled and said, "Zuiyu, you can't compare to your junior brother in this regard. He's able to remain calm despite knowing that he can't do much and will find it very difficult to change the established fate." Zuiyu fell silent. "That was the 4th time?" Chen Qingdu asked with a smile. "No," Zuiyu replied. "Then I won't hit you anymore," Chen Qingdu said with a nod. "I'll let you keep some face, lest you feel uncomfortable when teaching your junior brother sword techniques in the future." "Now it's 4 times, Zuiyu said. Chen Qingdu clasped his hands behind his back and walked away, saying, "Compared to chatting with you, I still prefer listening to Chen Pingan speak." Die. Chen Pingan took a stroll to the dragon-slaying platform at night, but he saw that Ning Yao was still cultivating. He then made his way to the training ground, deciding to walk around its perimeter. Just as he was about to finish the first lap, he changed direction slightly and walked in a bigger circle. Ning Yao arrived beside him at some unknown time, and Chen Pingan wasn't surprised at all. She had already learned Nalan Yeshing's stealth abilities a long time ago. Ning Yao hadn't been refining her extremely high-grade innate bonded flying sword these past years, and she had instead been refining something else. Nonetheless, she was capable of easily killing Pang Yuanji, Qi Shou, and the others even if she only summoned her bonded flying sword. This was what she had casually told Chen Pingan when chatting with him before, her tone calm and natural. However, she had been looking at him intently. Chen Pingan had just been about to reach over and place his hand on top of hers at the time, but he had silently retracted it before chuckling and using his hand as a fan. The two of them walked into the pavilion, and Chen Pingan sat cross-legged beside Ning Yao. She continued on the topic from earlier in the morning, saying, "In the very beginning, around 10 prodigies were identified in Wang Zongping's generation. Compared to us, however, they were far inferior in both number and cultivation aptitude. Among them, Mi Quan's great Dao should have been the most impressive, but it was a pity that he died in the first battle beyond the city wall that he participated in. Only 3 people remain from that generation, with one of them being Wang Zongping. However, he was caught up in an intense battle between 2 immortal tier cultivators, one friend and one foe, and this left him severely wounded and trapped at the barrier of the nascent tier, unable to make any progress for many years. Apart from him, there's also Wang Wei and Su Yong. Su Yong's innate aptitude was actually better than that of Wang Zongping's, who lagged at the bottom of the group, but his sword heart wasn't resolute and pure enough. He participated in a large-scale battle, yet he purposely held back and only engaged in small skirmishes, not daring to abandon his sense of self and fight with his life on the line. He always thought that cultivating in peace and quiet, and living to 100 years old would allow him to slowly but steadily advance to the upper 5 tiers. At that time he could then unleash his full strength in battle. However, breaking through the barrier of the nascent tier is one of the most dangerous battles at the Sword Qi Great Wall. And not only did Su Yong fail to advance to the unpolished Jade tier, but he was even rejected by the sword intent of heaven and earth, causing his cultivation base to fall instead. In the end, he was reduced to a golden core tier sword cultivator with a mangled and leaky core abode. Su Yong kept a low profile for many years, wandering around the mortal streets and alleys, and eventually became an alcoholic and a gambling addict, racking up countless debts and living a life even worse than that of rodents on the streets. When they were still young, Qi Shou and the others loved to invite Su Yong over for a drink, with the latter not caring about becoming the butt of jokes and ridicule as long as he could drink. He lived a very undignified life. As Qi Shou and the others gradually advanced and became stronger, they slowly grew bored of picking on Su Yong. Thus, Su Yong started to run errands between the city and Mirage Market, drinking wine if he earned a small sum of money and indulging in gambling if he earned a large sum of money. Ning Yao had done some last-minute cramming and learned this information from Grandma Bai. Will Su Yong harbor resentment toward the entire Sword Qi Great Wall? Chen Pingan asked bluntly. Ning Yao thought for a moment before shaking her head and replying, "Most probably not." A few years before Aoyang left the Sword Qi Great Wall, Su Yong would often accompany him regardless of whether he was drinking wine or acting as the dealer of a gambling game. Chen Pingan nodded and said, "Only Wang Wei has become a sword immortal, and he had already become a low-level guest elder of the Qi clan when he was still a golden core tier sword cultivator. He successfully advanced to the upper 5 tiers 20 years ago, following which he established his own residence and became Dao partners with a woman from a large clan. It can be said that he's living a happy and fulfilled life." Listening to the casual chatter at the wine shop, it seems like many people are surprised about Wang Wei overtaking the others and becoming a sword immortal. Wang Wei was indeed very unassuming and unremarkable, and it's naturally very rare for people in the majestic world to advance to the upper 5 tiers at 90-odd years old, Ning Yao said in agreement. However, as an unpolished Jade tier sword cultivator who was able to survive those large-scale battles, it was only natural that Wang Wei eventually became the leader of that generation. Because of this, it's no surprise that Wang Wei is often compared to those from the previous generation, making him appear very mediocre as a result. If he's compared to our generation, then not only do Pang Yuanji, Qi Shou, and Gao Yeho look down on Wang Wei, someone who likes to act obsequiously despite being a sword immortal, but even Sanqiu, Fatty Yan, and the others look down on him. Ning Yao's voice was quiet as she continued. In saying this, being able to survive as a sword cultivator at the Sword Qi Great Wall is already the greatest achievement, regardless of one's cultivation base. Once someone dies, what does it matter whether they were a prodigy or a sword immortal? Young sword cultivators like us might be drinking and making jokes about the abject Su Yong and the obsequious Wang Wei today, but after the next large-scale battle, Perhaps Wang Wei might drink with his friends and chat about some young sword cultivators who are no longer in the world. After arriving at the pavilion atop dragon-slaying cliff, Ning Yao suddenly stopped and said, "Give me a pot of wine." Chen Pingan removed his hands from his sleeve and handed Ning Yao a pot of bamboo sea small world wine from his wine shop. As she drank, Ning Yao said, "Grandpa Little Dong is a true prodigy, ascending the city wall as an abode tier cultivator, and descending the city wall as a sea observation tier cultivator. When he was at the Dragon Gate tier, he was already able to kill more than a dozen demons at the same cultivation base as well as 3 demons at the Golden Core tier, earning him the nickname of Sword Maniac." Afterward, Grandpa Little Dong left the Sword Chi Great Wall by himself and ventured through the savage world to temper his sword intent, having already advanced to the upper 5 tiers when he eventually returned. He killed countless demons in the subsequent battles, and he was regarded as a young sword cultivator who had the greatest chance of becoming an Ascension tier sword immortal. Dong Guanpu's collusion with the demon tribe had caused widespread outrage at the Sword Chi Great Wall, and he was ultimately killed by old great sword immortal Chen Qingdu before the Lord Hidden official could even act. Back then, Chen Pingan had personally witnessed this scene while standing on the city wall. Ning Yao continued to drink wine as she said, "Not long after Grandpa Little Dong died, some people started to speculate that he was the one who personally organized the assassination attempt on me at Mirage Market all those years back." Ning Yao smiled and continued, "I don't believe this, but I can't stop other people from running their mouths. Disregarding the truth of the matter, do these speculations make you feel sad?" Chen Pingan asked. "There's nothing to be sad about," Ning Yao replied with a shake of her head. "That's good to hear. Otherwise, for the next while, I wouldn't have left the Ning residence apart from going to the city wall to practice sword techniques," Chen Pingan said with a nod. "Something else is going to happen apart from little Lu Duan facing an assassination attempt?" Ning Yao asked in puzzlement. "Definitely," Chen Pingan replied with a smile. "Someone wants to test my mettle, and at the same time they're also trying their best to isolate the Ning residents. At the end of the day, their true purpose is to distract you as much as possible and hinder your ability to advance. They didn't have an opportunity in the past, and no one dared to openly target the Ning residents after the incident at Mirage Market, the matter relating to Dong Guanpu, and the old great sword immortal personally unleashing a sword strike. However, my arrival has given them a new avenue to target you. Why don't you seem annoyed at all about these matters?" Ning Yao asked. "I actually feel annoyed, but I choose to ignore these matters because I understand that feeling annoyed won't help. In fact, I don't even think about these matters at all." Chen Pingan reached over to grab the wine pot, and Ning Yao was just about to subconsciously hand it over. However, she quickly shot a glare at him instead. Having failed to achieve his goal, Chen Pingan placed his hands inside his opposite sleeves and said, "Just how capable is this outsider Chen Pingan? This naturally comes down to 2 attributes, his cultivation base and his heart. Regarding my fist techniques as a pure martial artist, this has already been proven thanks to the help from Rani, Puyu, Qishou, and Pang Yuanji. As for my heart, there are some things I deem very important and others I consider less important. If our opponents are shrewd and calculating, they'll test every aspect of my heart. For example, the Ning residents and the Guo clan will comprehensively grow distant if Guozhujiu is successfully assassinated, and this will be the case regardless of how reasonable and righteous sword immortal Guojia is. The members of the Guo clan have already had thorns in their hearts for a very long time. Of course, things have naturally taken a different turn given that the assassination attempt on Guozhujiu was foiled. Regarding how to examine my stance on what I think is less important, the process is actually very simple. If a child from one of those impoverished alleys is killed, then business at Daizhang's wine shop will quickly dry up, and I'll no longer play the role of a teacher either. Even if I go, there's no doubt that no one will turn up to listen to those fantastical stories anymore. They need to pay a significant price to kill Guozhujiu, but to kill an ordinary child from an impoverished alley? Who would care? But if I don't care, how will the mini-sword cultivators at the Sword Chi Great Wall view me? And if I care, what level of care counts as caring?" Ning Yao's brows were knitted in worry as she listened on. See, Grandma Bai was clearly incorrect. Chen Pingan was evidently able to figure everything out. "What are you worried about?" Chen Pingan asked with a smile. "I've already thought of this possibility, so their chance of succeeding won't be very big. However, there are some matters where we can only wait for others to act first, even if we've already thought of the possibility. For example? Ning Yao asked. For example, announcing to the world that I'm the scholarly sage's disciple, An's Yu's junior brother. This won't be too bad, and it will only be like a tickle. After all, sword cultivators at the Sword Qi Great Wall care more about a person's cultivation base. Chen Pingan paused for a moment before continuing. And for example, some young sword cultivator without any background of note becoming drunk and bringing up the past matters of the Ning residents in front of me. Their words most likely won't be too extreme, lest they appear unreasonable and spark public outrage. At that time, some of the customers at the wine shop might even step forward to help me. Thus, they'll definitely plan their words very carefully, striking a good balance where they can provoke me to the point of lashing out in anger, yet not take things too far that they appear to be causing trouble on purpose. Rather, they'll be speaking with genuine emotion and righteousness. That being the case, I'll definitely stand to lose regardless of whether my punch kills them or not. Youthful vigor is fleeting, and a cunning mind isn't the mark of a sword cultivator. Ning Yao thought for a moment before suggesting, then we'll visit Dai Zhang's wine shop less in the future? People won't go out of their way to block you if you only travel between the city wall and the Ning residence, right? That would be far too obvious. There are many sword cultivators at the Sword Qi Great Wall, but there aren't many fools. Chen Pingan shook his head and replied, we still need to go. Ning Yao couldn't wrap her head around this. Bookkeepers like to perform calculations on their abacuses, but they also have their own lives to live. They won't sit behind the counter all day and all night to calculate profits and losses. Just who am I? Just how many years have I lived with nothing to my name? Will I still be afraid of these matters? Chen Pingan stood up and gazed at the training ground as he continued slowly. You've listened to their nonsensical bullshit for so many years, so I want to listen with my own ears. So be it if you weren't willing to acknowledge them before, but now that I'm by your side, I'll directly launch a punch if anyone dares to run over with ill intentions. Otherwise, should I treat them to some wine instead? Upon saying this, Chen Pingan smiled and remarked, it will most definitely just be a casual punch, as their cultivation base won't be very high. They'll definitely be even weaker than Rainy. Otherwise, no one will feel sympathy for them if their cultivation base is too high. Then, when should we visit the wine shop? Ning Yao asked. This was her temperament. Chen Pingan wasn't surprised at all. Disregarding his feelings for her, Ning Yao's temperament and manner of doing things at the small town all those years ago had actually had a huge effect on Chen Pingan. Ning Yao's remark that the Great Tao shouldn't be so small was one aspect, and this had caused Chen Pingan to never truly crane his head to look up at those immortals in the mountains after he left the Jewel's small world and came into contact with cultivation. At the same time, Ning Yao's straightforward and decisive manner of doing things also left a deep impression on Chen Pingan, especially her attitude of accepting the reality of the situation and focusing on how to respond. It was thanks to this clarity in his mind that Chen Pingan could truly become fearless in the face of the many unexpected troubles. He would simply deal with whatever came his way. Chen Pingan turned around and replied with a smile, we'll visit after I recover from my wounds. In the meantime, we can give them some time to plan and prepare. Truth be told, I often feel anxious for my enemies, and I almost feel the urge to teach them what to do to maximize their benefits and repulse others to the greatest degree. Ning Yao remained silent. Chen Pingan sat down beside her and said in a soft voice, don't feel like I'm unfamiliar. I've always been like this, but as I told you before, there's only one matter that I never overthink. I'm not saying this to please you, and it's simply the sincere truth. Things wouldn't have been so troublesome for you if you didn't like me and if you didn't come here, and you would have been able to enjoy a better life. In fact, you could have even waited until you became a sword immortal in the future to come here to look for me. I would have still waited for you all the same, Ning Yao replied in a soft voice. Grandma Bai was right. She had to be herself, and she also had to trust Chen Pingan. She needed to voice the feelings accumulated in her heart to him, not caring about whether they were reasonable or not. In any case, he was a most reasonable person, so she didn't need to worry about the two of them running out of things to talk about. Chen Pingan didn't respond to this, and he instead retrieved the small dragon-slaying platform that Ning Yao had given him when they had parted ways at Stalactite Mountain back then. the one inscribed with the characters Ningyao and innocent on the two sides. Chen Pingan looked down at the characters Ningyao, gently tapping them with his fingers as he opened his eyes wide and scolded. Who are you? How are you so daring and capable? You're making me feel so sad and heartbroken. If you continue to act so insensibly, then I'll pretend to ignore you in the future. Ningyao turned to her side and rested her arms and head on the railing, with her eyelashes quivering slightly as she smiled widely. The radiant moonlight accentuated her slender eyebrows. Die. On this day, the second shopkeeper, who had already been absent for a long time, finally appeared at the wine shop to drink. He didn't fight for a seat with the other customers, and he instead squatted to the side and accompanied some familiar sword cultivators. He held a wine bowl in one hand, and a pair of chopsticks in his other, and on the ground in front of him was a small plate of pickled vegetables from the Yen clan's shop. There was nothing embarrassing about this, as everyone was doing the same thing. According to the second shopkeeper, sword immortals served as pillars between heaven and earth, so what did it matter that some dishes were placed on the ground? This was a sign of the sword cultivators being down to earth and approachable, and the sword immortals not getting hung up on small details. Would this be possible at the large restaurants with extremely expensive wine? Perhaps the waiters wouldn't stop someone from placing dishes on the ground, and maybe the nearby customers wouldn't say anything either. However, they would definitely roll their eyes at the culprit, no? But what about here? Could such an upsetting reaction take place at this wine shop? Most definitely not. The sword cultivators who came here to buy wine and drink wine, especially those alcoholics with few immortal coins in their pockets, all found this to be extremely reasonable. Today, no sword immortal had graced the wine shop yet, and Chen Pingan was smiling and sipping wine as he casually chatted with the familiar sword cultivators around him. An unfamiliar young man suddenly stood up, inebriated and holding a wine bowl as he staggered over to Chen Pingan's location. He burped and asked with clouded eyes, "Are you Chen Pingan, the Ning residence's son-in-law?" Chen Pingan smiled and nodded in response. The young man was just about to say something, but Chen Pingan raised his hand and lightly tapped his chopsticks together. Seeing this, Daizhong ran inside the shop with a stern expression and retrieved a piece of paper. The young man paid no heed to this and he continued, "Are you worthy of Ningyao? I don't think so. You're unworthy of Ningyao even if you managed to defeat Peng Yuanji and the others. Fortunately for you, however, you are indeed worthy of the Ning residence. Do you know why?" Chen Pingan ate some picked vegetables before raising his wine pot and pointing behind himself. Daizhong unfurled the piece of paper, revealing the words, "Those who mention the historical matters of the Ning residence to me today can drink punishment wine free of charge." There were dozens of customers at the wine shop, and they all became alert and guarded at this moment, with some of them no longer drinking and eating. Of course, there were also those who reacted more slowly, and were still drinking and eating pickled vegetables. The young man couldn't care less about this, and he took a large swig of wine. A decent amount of wine spilled from the white bowl, and his eyes were bloodshot as he exclaimed in rage. The Sword Chi Great Wall was almost destroyed, but the Lord Hidden official stepped forward to participate in the first life-and-death battle against the demon tribe. Her opponent immediately surrendered without even entering the battlefield, and following that, we won many life-and-death battles in succession. In the end, we were only one battle away from rendering those despicable great demons from the savage world helpless, just a single battle away. Yet, just how helpful was that immortal couple from the Ning residence? Those two sword immortals were truly gifting those despicable great demons whatever they needed. The savage world is shameless, and they would have launched an assault on the Sword Chi Great Wall, even if they lost the life and death battles. However, the Sword Chi Great Wall understands shame and honor. If we hadn't won the final battle, would you, Chen Pingan, have been able to come to the Sword Chi Great Wall? Would you have been able to act all high and mighty here? You're quite the impressive one, aren't you? You're the scholarly sage's disciple and Zui Yu's junior brother, correct? Do you know why Stalactite Mountain Sword Reverence Pagoda specifically didn't hang up the portraits of the Ning residence's two sword immortals a few years ago? You're the Ning residence's son-in-law and a top-notch prodigy, so why don't you tell me, Chen Pingan took a sip of wine and lightly put down his chopsticks. Daizhong tossed away the piece of paper and retrieved another piece from her sleeve, furiously unfurling it to reveal the words, "Those who mention Ningyao's parents can eat my fist." Begging for mercy is useless. The young man shot a sideways glance at the piece of paper and burst into laughter, remarking, as expected of a scholar from the scholarly sage's lineage, "Such impressive knowledge, you were even able to guess this. What are you going to do? Kill me with a single punch?" He raised his arm and furiously threw the wine bowl to the ground, shattering it into smithereens as he spat. "It's revolting to drink wine from the Ning residence." Chen Pingan slowly stood up, still holding the wine bowl that was more than half full. The young man stuck his neck out and pointed at his head, saying in provocation, "Come on, I'm waiting for your fist. You can punch me here if you're so capable." He sneered and continued, "You've coincidentally come to the Sword Chi Great Wall during a break in battle both times, so perhaps this was all planned by the disciple of the scholarly sage rather than a coincidence? In any case, that's a reflection of your ability, as was your feat of winning those 4 battles. So, you punching me, a C observation tier sword cultivator, to death will also be a reflection of your ability, no? You often go to the city wall to practice fist techniques and put on a show, and it's not that you don't want to kill some demons, but rather that they don't dare to attack the Sword Chi Great Wall after seeing you, right? If you ask me, I'd say that your ability is almost greater than all of the sword immortals combined. What do you say, Chen Pingan?" Chen Pingan glanced at the shattered wine bowl on the ground. The young sword cultivator glared at him with wide eyes and huffed, "You want wine money? I have wine money. I've been to the city wall once and to the south once, and even though I didn't earn much money, I still earned enough to purchase a few bowls of your crappy wine." He was just about to retrieve some immortal coins from his sleeve when Chen Pingan suddenly said, "You don't need to pay for this bowl of wine." The C observation tier sword cultivator roared with laughter, certain that Chen Pingan wouldn't dare to punch him. He was just about to mock him further. At this instant, however, a fist slammed into the young sword cultivator's head and sent him spinning through the air, with his head smashing into the ground and his legs kicking up. He died on the spot, collapsing limply to the ground. Not only that, but his soul was shattered as well, leaving him as dead as could be. Holding a wine bowl in his right hand and pointing at the corpse with his left hand, Chen Pingan smiled faintly and said, "The demon tribe now owes me money for a bowl of wine thanks to you, and the savage world will need to repay this the next time a battle breaks out in the south." After saying this, Chen Pingan raised the wine bowl in his hand and looked around, saying with loud laughter, "A few ounces of wine in small cups and large bowls, washing away the ugly filth of the world. Sword immortals of the future. Who's willing to share a drink with me before we travel south beyond the city wall?" Among the customers in the wine shop and the sword cultivator squatting on the ground, a few people stood up, after which everyone stood up. They topped up their wine cups and wine bowls. Chen Pingan gazed into the distance and announced loudly, "Those at the Sword Chi Great Wall, those sword immortals who yearn to kill more enemies, you're all invited to share a drink with me." On this day, an especially large number of sword cultivators and sword immortals at the Sword Chi Great Wall raised their cups and bowls to enjoy a drink. Chen Pingan visited the wine shop 10 days after the incident, and even though it was close to New Year, there was no festive atmosphere at the Sword Chi Great Wall. This was in stark contrast to the majestic world. Thanks to the second shopkeeper, Shopkeeper Daizhong was becoming increasingly renowned at the Sword Chi Great Wall. She also learned much about doing business from Chen Pingan, and became increasingly adept at dealing with customers. Put simply, Daizhong was more confident and able to act more shamelessly now. If someone asked, "Shopkeeper, you're not going to treat the customers to some free wine today? You've earned so many immortal coins from us, so you need to treat us at least once, right?" Daizhong would respond, "Do sword immortals like you need assistance or handouts when killing demons or drinking wine?" Boos would ring out from all of the tables, but Daizhong was able to remain completely unfazed now. After greeting Daizhong and some customers he was familiar with, Chen Pingan grabbed a small stool and went over to sit at the intersection of the small alley and the street. However, no one walked over to listen to his fantastical stories today, as many children hesitated and took a detour when they saw the young man in azure. Apart from the little boy carrying the ceramic money pot being locked at home by his parents and Zhang Jiajin needing to work elsewhere to earn money, the remaining children didn't dare to come. They didn't necessarily think that Chen Pingan was a bad person, but he had ultimately punched someone to death at the wine shop. Some of the children and some of their elders had personally witnessed this. This was human nature, And Chen Pingan wasn't surprised at all, much less disappointed. After sitting there for a while and basking in the warm sunshine of late winter while snacking on roasted seeds, he picked up the small stool and returned to the wine shop. He didn't help serve customers. Instead, he sat behind the counter and worked the abacus as he went over the accounts book. Finding a moment of spare time between serving wine and snacks, Daizhong walked over and hesitated for a moment before saying, "Business hasn't been impacted." Chen Pingan closed the accounts book and lightly ran his hand across the abacus, looking up and asking with a smile, "Have you been itching to ask me whether that person was truly a spy for the demon tribe? And regardless of the truth, you want to hear a clear answer from me, seeing that you're Ningyao's and my friend?" Daizhong shook her head without hesitation and replied, "No, I don't want to ask this. I already have an answer in my mind." Chen Pingan deftly worked the abacus and said slowly, "If the difference in strength is immense, or if the opponent is profoundly calculating, then one can only accept the outcome even if one loses. The heart will have to accept the outcome even if the mouth doesn't. I've lost under these circumstances before, and more than once. Those were miserable losses, but I benefited greatly from reviewing them afterward. What's frightening is those schemes that can be seen through with a single glance, yet are still able to succeed and genuinely repulse people. The culprits aren't striving to achieve any sort of victory, and they're instead just toying around with others." There was something else that Chen Pingan didn't say. The savage world was going to unleash its full strength to attack the Sword Qi Great Wall very soon, and this assault wouldn't be too far away, even if it wasn't the next battle. That being the case, they could wantonly burn some of their insignificant pawns in the city to the north. This would also serve as a reminder to some of the critical pawns that were hidden even deeper. Chen Pingan glanced outside the wine shop and continued, "Someone is making preparations behind the scenes, so if I become careless and think that the schemes at the Sword Qi Great Wall are completely inferior to the schemes at the Majestic World, I'll eventually get wounded if not killed, perhaps even affecting those around me. The mastermind behind the scenes is taking my personality into account when targeting me, and they've realized that I like to avoid mistakes when doing things. As such, they're purposely allowing me to enjoy small win after small win." Daizhong smiled and commented, "Small wins?" Peng Yuanji and Qishou would stomp their feet and curse if they heard this. Ignoring Qishou, Peng Yuanji definitely wouldn't come here to drink anymore. He wouldn't even want to purchase the cheapest drink. Chen Pingan chuckled and replied, "That was indeed just a small win. Peng Yuanji and Qishou know this, the spectating sword immortals know this, and those who need to know this also know this. Even though that young man was purposely provoking me, many of his points were actually fair, seeing that I'm not a genuine sword cultivator and not native to the Sword Qi Great Wall. However, it was a shame for him that his words were completely predictable, making it very difficult for him to defeat me. I was able to defeat Qishou and Peng Yuanji before because I was more unpredictable." Daizhong sighed and said, "Chen Pingan, do you know that you're terrifying?" It was as if two people were playing a game of Go, yet one player was always able to guess the other player's moves. How would the other player feel? Some things had already taken place, but there were still some matters that Chen Sanxiu, Fatty Yan, and the others weren't aware of. For example, when asking Daizhong to retrieve a piece of paper for him to write on, Chen Pingan had smiled and said that the person who walked into his trap would definitely be a young person without a high cultivation base, yet had definitely traveled to the battlefield to the south before. As such, this person could garner more empathy from the many sword cultivators at the Sword Qi Great Wall, causing them to feel a sense of sympathy and pity. At the same time, this person could also incite shared hostility toward him. Perhaps this person would even be a so-called ordinary person with an amazing reputation in their hometown, kindly helping their neighbors all year round. The mastermind wouldn't need to fan the flames following the death of this person, and they simply needed to sit back and watch things unfold. Otherwise, they would be completely looking down on the inspectors appointed by the hidden official of the Sword Qi Great Wall. Whispers would naturally form at the base level of society before slowly spreading through the streets and alleys, restaurants and wine shops, all kinds of other shops, and eventually the large and wealthy clans, as well as the many sword immortals. Some people would ignore this while some people would quietly commit it to memory. Of course, Chen Pingan had described this as the worst-case scenario, one that wouldn't necessarily play out. In any case, things wouldn't become too bad. given that the mastermind behind the scenes was only treating this as a small test. Dai Zhang had initially been worried that Chen Pingan would get angry at her words, but he surprisingly continued to smile in a natural and relaxed manner, almost as if he had anticipated this comment from her as well. This was the second time that Chen Pingan had received a comment like this. The fact that you're saying this to my face means that you genuinely view me as a friend. Chen Pingan nodded and continued. Also, it's only right that my enemies should feel terrified. I feel slightly more at ease with you by Ning Yao's side, Dai Zhang said. I'll also feel more at ease if you're still willing to say the same thing after the next large-scale battle in the south, Chen Pingan replied with a smile. Dai Zhang's expression suddenly became solemn. Chen Pingan nodded and continued in a quiet voice. Indeed, this is also an intentional act from those masterminds behind the scenes. Firstly, they wanted to confirm whether the new arrival, Chen Pingan, the disciple of the scholarly sage and the son-in-law of the Ning residents, would truly ascend the city wall to fight alongside the sword cultivators. Secondly, would he dare to leave the city and venture to the battlefield in the south to fight against the demons? And thirdly, what kind of balance would he strike between fighting conservatively to stay alive and fighting ferociously with all his power? Would he choose to stay safe above all else, or would he be willing to die for his honor and the honor of the Ning residents? Of course, the best-case scenario for the masterminds would have been me dying as a brave martyr on the battlefield to the south. If they were in a good mood, they might have even instructed some people to praise me. There was a look of amusement on Chen Pingan's face as he asked, "You're treating the chair that my master sat on as a family heirloom, keeping it safe in the wing room of your small residence. So do you think any random person can sit on the small stools that were on either side of the scholarly sage?" Heavy emotions weighed on Dai Zhang's mind as she grabbed a pot of wine, cracked open the clay seal, poured out 2 bowls and then took a large swig. She appeared despondent and silent. Chen Pingan raised his wine bowl and took a sip of wine, saying with a smile, "Don't drink too much. We might be the shopkeepers, but we still need to pay for the wine." Still holding the wine bowl, Dai Zhang wanted to say something, but she couldn't help but hesitate. "You still have questions? Feel free to ask," Chen Pingan said. "Was the person who stood up first a paid actor?" Dai Zhang asked in a quiet voice. A wide smile stretched across Chen Pingan's face as he shook his hand and replied, "No, he wasn't." He then pointed at Dai Zhang and continued, "Shopkeeper, you can feel at ease and continue to do business. You're genuinely not cut out for scheming and plotting. If I hired a paid actor, would I not be treating all of the sword cultivators at the Sword Qi Great Wall as naive fools who know nothing more than practicing sword techniques, especially those sword immortals who were observing from afar? There are some matters where it seemingly looks like we can attain perfection and reap more benefits, but in reality we definitely can't act too deliberately. Doing so would instead be a blemish. Take me for example. My initial objective was simply to avoid defeat, so killing that person was already a form of breaking even. However, I would have drawn needless ire and condescension from others if I had pushed further and tried to gild the lily." Dai Zhang heaved a heavy sigh, raising her wine bowl with a complicated expression and repeating what Chen Pingan had said earlier. "Let us drink away the ugly filth of the world." Chen Pingan smiled and raised his wine bowl, touching it with Dai Zhang's as he said, "Thanks for the treat, shopkeeper Dai Zhang." There was a winter palace in the west of the city, used by the hidden official to shelter from the cold. There was a summer palace in the east of the city as well, and both palaces weren't very big. However, the expenditure for maintaining them was colossal. The hidden official was hiding in the winter palace and standing on an exquisite royal chair in the main hall, an immortal item from the majestic world's flowing dawn continent. The grains of the redwood were like flowing water and drifting clouds. There were 2 other native sword immortals in the main hall, both of whom served the hidden official. The man was called Juan, and the woman was called Luo Shan. Both were relatively old unpolished jade tier cultivators. Apart from them, there was also a nascent tier cultivator responsible for summarizing and reporting intelligence, and right now he was giving a detailed account of the commotion at the wine shop. Everything about the deceased sea observation tier sword cultivator had been investigated, from his ancestry to his cultivation lineage, friends, senior acquaintances, and so on. Everything was reported in detail to Sword Immortal Juan. As for the hidden official, she had never been interested in these matters. Also present in the main hall was Peng Yuanji, as well as a noble scholar from the Confucian sect. The noble scholar was called Wang Zhai, and he had some ties to the previous Confucian sage who had overseen the Sword Qi Great Wall. The hidden official paced around the chair with her eyes closed, and it looked as if she were sleepwalking as her body swayed around and her hands tugged on her twin braids. Sword Immortal Zhuan flipped through the intelligence report in his hands as he listened to his subordinate's report. Fine details were extremely important, so the intelligence report was naturally very wordy and long. This was also the reason why the hidden official never touched these intelligence reports. Sword Immortal Luoshan was wearing a round collar brocade robe and a resplendent red flower hairpin. Noble scholar Wang Zhai was similar to an imperial censor in an imperial court of the majestic world, so he didn't have the right to explicitly become involved in these intelligence matters. However, he could provide suggestions and counsel if it were absolutely necessary. In the words of Lord Hidden Official, they needed to at least give these outsiders holding a royal sword the opportunity to say a few words. As for whether she listened, however, that would be completely up to her mood. After listening to the intelligence reports, Wang Zhai said, "The fact of the matter is that no concrete evidence exists to prove that Huang Zhou was a spy for the demon tribe. That being the case, might Chen Pingan be accused of killing an innocent person? Taking a step back, this matter should have been handled by us even if Huang Zhou were truly a spy for the demon tribe. And if he wasn't a spy, and if the conflict was simply one of ego between young people, then is this not a case of disregarding human life?" Peng Yuanji frowned and didn't say anything, keeping his head down to drink instead. As the only direct disciple of the hidden official, there were many times when his words were even more effective than those of Zhu An and Luo Shan, two senior sword immortals. However, Peng Yuanji wasn't fond of becoming involved in these troublesome matters, and he preferred to focus his full attention on cultivation. Bad people need to be punished by other bad people, made to suffer until they regret doing bad, Luo Shan said indifferently. There's indeed no need to worry about any taboo when speaking at the Sword Qi Great Wall, and even lower 5-tier cultivators can scold Dong Seng with no issues, given that Dong Seng himself doesn't mind. Of course, they'll simply be asking for death if Dong Seng lashes out in anger. That Chen Pingan was clearly waiting for others to run over and challenge him, so if Huang Zhou were smarter, he should have relented after seeing the first piece of paper held up behind Chen Pingan. Is it important whether he was a spy for the demon tribe or not? He died because of his own stupidity, so he can't blame Chen Pingan for reacting too severely. As for Chen Pingan, does he genuinely think he's a sword cultivator at the Sword Qi Great Wall? How impudent! I'll instruct someone to especially keep track of Chen Pingan's performance in the next large-scale battle in the south. You can afford to speak less regarding this matter, Luo Shan, Zhuan said with a stern expression. Sword Immortal Luo Shan had experienced some conflicts with the couple from the Ning residence in the past, leaving both parties unhappy. Regarding Luo Shan's assessment of the situation, it couldn't be said that she was speaking for Chen Pingan. At most, she was suggesting 50 canes for each person, although half of these canes would land on the body of a deceased person. Wang Zhai had participated in one large-scale battle during his 7 to 8 years at the Sword Qi Great Wall, but he hadn't been involved in much of the action, and he had instead acted like more of a military supervisor and battlefield recorder. The hidden official had said that since he was a noble scholar, he was definitely someone who had read many scriptures and books. At the same time, he was definitely soft and frail, so he shouldn't become involved in those violent battles. Wang Zhai had been incensed upon hearing this, and he had even reported the matter to a Confucian sage. This was to no avail. Luo Shan smiled and asked, "Then what do you suggest, Sword Immortal Zhuan? Should we call Chen Pingan over to ask for his opinion? He's a disciple of the scholarly sage, and he also has a senior brother who's divinely skilled at swordsmanship watching over him from the city wall." There was a cloudy expression on Zhuan's face. According to the rules, he naturally needed to ask Chen Pingan for his opinion. However, that young man was too skilled at speaking and interacting with others, and his backers were also far too powerful. The scholarly sage is no longer the scholarly sage, and Chen Pingan should also act in adherence with the rules and etiquette since he's a disciple of the Confucian sect. He shouldn't kill people on a whim. I would say the same thing even if that old man, who no longer has a position in the scholarly temple, were present. This junior is able to question Chen Pingan if it's troublesome for my two seniors, Wang Zhai said. Where should we question him? Here. Or at the Ning residence? Zhuan asked. Wang Zhai understood the sword immortal's insinuation, so he relented and said, I can visit the Ning residence, lest we make things too embarrassing for Chen Pingan. Luoshan pursed her lips before saying, That sounds better. Otherwise, I would need to worry about great sword immortals hurrying over immediately after Chen Pingan. Peng Yuanji sighed and put away his wine pot, saying with a faint smile, Ordinary sword cultivators might ponder about whether Huang Zhou was a pawn of the demon tribe or not, but are we not aware? I'm only sticking to the facts, Wang Zhai said. Huang Zhou was widely praised in the Sword Qi Great Wall's Dayu Ridge Alley, and I carefully went over his performance on the battlefield as well. It can be said that he fought with his full strength. Let me be very frank. Sword cultivators like Huang Zhou might not possess a high cultivation base and might not kill many enemies on the battlefield, but they make up the foundation of the Sword Qi Great Wall. I dare say that many ordinary sword cultivators will feel disillusioned if this matter isn't properly addressed, and is simply glossed over. Being fair in reward and punishment is an ironclad rule of the Sword Qi Great Wall, but are we going to dismiss this fact because Chen Pingan is a sage's disciple and a great sword immortal's junior brother? After saying this, Wang Zhai looked toward Zhuan and Luoshan with a resolute expression, with the noble scholar's demeanor seeming like he would refuse to back down even if he were opposed by tens of thousands of people. The hidden official opened her eyes and stood on the edge of the chair, rocking back and forth like a roly-poly toy. She didn't spare the noble scholar so much as a single glance as she said in a lazy voice, If there are 10,000 people like Huang Zhou in the city, then the old great sword immortal would scold me for failing my duty if I only managed to kill 9,999. He would punish me by forbidding me to drink wine for however many years again. Zhuan and Luoshan immediately stood up after she spoke. The nascent tier sword cultivator appeared even more solemn, as if he were listening to an imperial edict. The hidden official covered her mouth and yawned, remarking, Have your brains all been scrambled after a few large-scale battles in a row? If that's the case, then drink more water and eat more rice, and stop focusing on nothing but sword practice, and more sword practice. That's a surefire way to fry your brain. Things are still okay for you, but some people have broken their brains from reading too many books. I can't save them. Noble scholar Wang Zhai was unfazed. The hidden official nodded to herself and continued, Even though I've never liked Chen Pingan, I feel like he's comparatively much more pleasant to the eye. I wonder why this is. Why? She pointed at Luoshan and said, Why don't you tell me? The moon tonight is beautiful, Luoshan replied with a smile. Fair point, the hidden official said with a nod. Wang Zhai stood there without moving. The hidden official was quite impressed with this scholar's shamelessness, and she signaled to Zhuan with her eyes, following which the latter immediately came up with an excuse to lead Wang Zhai away from the main hall. Luoshan also left with the nascent tier sword cultivator. Only the hidden official and her disciple remained in the main hall. Peng Yuanji smiled and asked, Master, does the second sage's lineage detest the scholarly sage's lineage this much? The hidden official waved her hand and beckoned Peng Yuanji over to the royal chair, and when he walked over, she immediately grabbed his cheek and gave it a solid twist, scolding, Yuanji, you've scrambled your brain the most from practicing sword techniques. Peng Yuanji didn't need to act too properly in front of his master, so he broke free from her small hand and massaged his cheek as he said in helplessness, Please enlighten me, master. The hidden official rolled her eyes and lamented. How did I find myself such a stupid disciple? Did you really think that Wang Zhai was targeting Chen Pingan? He was trying to tie us together to vouch for Chen Pingan's innocence. How did you not see through such a simple ploy? In any case, I insist on opposing him, and a smarty-pants like Chen Pingan won't be affected at all. Peng Yuanji carefully mulled over this for a moment before nodding in response. He also felt slightly angry, what with Wang Zhai actually daring to scheme against his master. However, the hidden official waved a hand and said, This is nothing. Wang Zhai is clearly suspicious of the Dong clan and suspicious of us as well. To be more precise, Wang Zhai is suspicious of everyone apart from Chan Qingdu and the three sages overseeing the Great Wall. For example, Wang Zhai is also suspicious of me, the hidden official. Do you think the Confucian sage who lost to me is a pushover, who would leave with his tail between his legs and appoint an utter fool to the sword Qi Great Wall to lose face again? Peng Yuanji smiled bitterly and replied, I'm not good with these types of things. The hidden official formed a sword seal with her hands, nonsensically waving it around as she said, Why would you need to be good at these things? You're destined to become the next hidden official, someone whose sword can whoosh out and kill many people. But master, you are very good at these things, Peng Yuanji remarked. Because I'm your master, she replied. Fair point, Peng Yuanji conceded with a nod. The hidden official jumped up in irritation and scolded. How shameless! Are you copying my words? Pay up. Wine will also suffice as payment. Peng Yuanji tossed his master a pot of bamboo sea small world wine, which the hidden official placed in the miniature small world inside her sleeve. Like ants moving nests, she was secretly accumulating a stock of wine. She couldn't drink any now, but she could store them for later, no? The new year was around the corner, and Ningyao asked Chen Pingan why he wasn't preparing any couplets and door gods. She had wandered around the small town in the jewel small world back then, and she had found the New Year's atmosphere quite festive and enjoyable, a feeling that she missed. Chen Pingan smiled and asked if the Sword Qi Great Wall even sold these goods, to which Ningyao replied that he could write and draw his own. However, Chen Pingan stated that he needed to adhere to local traditions and customs, and shouldn't go out of his way to put up couplets and door gods. Ningyao was slightly angry, not understanding why they needed to care about other people's opinions. Chen Pingan once again stressed that they did need to care. Ningyao truly became a little angry, so Chen Pingan explained in detail the reasons behind his decision and in the end, told Ningyao to be patient regarding this matter. He was going to stay at the Sword Qi Great Wall for a very long time, so perhaps he would still have opportunities to do business pertaining to couplets and door gods in the future, just like how the restaurants and wine shops in the city all put up couplets and horizontal scrolls now. Only after hearing this did Ningyao relent. Chen Pingan visited the city wall again after recovering from his wounds, looking for senior brothers Wu Yu to continue his sword training. He learned his lesson this time, and he directly took a bottle of ointment with him, intending to treat his wounds on the city wall before returning. That way, no one else would need to see his scary-looking wounds, especially so close to the new year. However, plans would often go awry, and Ningyao made her way to the city wall at midnight after completing her cultivation at the dragon-slaying platform and not seeing Chen Pingan return for a long time. When Ningyao arrived, she saw Chen Pingan lying on the ground 10 paces away from Zui Yu and bandaging his own wounds. He had most likely suffered serious wounds during the training session, or else, with his habit of tempering his physique until he was half dead, he would have already summoned his talismanic boat and returned to the Ning residence as if nothing had happened at all. Ningyao sat beside Chen Pingan before turning around to glare at Zui Yu and grumble, It's almost New Year. Zui Yu tried to find the right words for half a day before finally nodding and saying, I'll be careful in the future. Chen Pingan was secretly amused by this. In the end, Zui Yu said, a sage in the past once stood on a riverbank and posed questions to the heavens, eventually leaving 173 questions for the later generations. Afterward, a scholar of some future generation composed a heavenly response to the 173 questions. You can look into this matter if you want. 1. Chen Pingan nodded in response. He could ask Chen Sancho to help him purchase the relevant books, since he also enjoyed reading and collecting books. He retrieved his talismanic boat, which Ningyao steered as they returned to the Ning residence. There was no tradition of having a New Year's Eve family dinner at the Sword Qi Great Wall, but at the Ning residence, Chen Pingan personally went to the kitchen to cook up a sumptuous dinner, letting Grandma buy rest for the day. Their friends would also have their own friends. Apart from Dong Huafu being relatively unsociable and not having many friends, Yanzhua had his own friendship groups, while Chen Sancho had even more friends. The new year arrived, and Chen Sancho visited Dai Zheng's wine shop with 3 of his good friends to enjoy a drink. The 4 of them shared one table, and Fan Dach, a descendant of a large clan, was so inebriated that tears and snot were flowing down his face. Chen Sancho was helpless about this, and the young man and young woman who had similar backgrounds to Fan Dach were also at a loss. Moreover, the 2 of them were Dao partners, so they were in even less of a position to say anything. This was because Fandach liked a young woman with a mismatched social status, but even though the Fan clan was very well off, the young woman had surprisingly turned her back on him and found herself a descendant of another large clan. Not only that, but they were even starting to discuss marriage now. Chen Sancho and Fandach's other friends were caught off guard as well, unable to comprehend why Yuchia, the sea observation tier young woman, had abandoned Fandach for someone else. Fandach was even more confused, so he drank until he became drunk and muttered absolute nonsense. Upon seeing Chen Pingan, Fandach yelled, "Oh my, if it isn't the second shopkeeper! It's rare for you to show up, so why don't you come over for a drink?" "Yes, a drink." Chen Pingan had coincidentally come here by himself to check the accounts book with Daizhong, yet Chen Sancho gestured to him with his eyes, calling Chen Pingan over to help them deal with the situation. Chen Pingan felt slightly exasperated. He had only seen Fandach and Yuchia twice, and he had seldom interacted with them, so what could they possibly talk about? Thus, he only brought 2 pots of wine over and sat beside Chen Sancho, opening one pot to quietly drink by himself. Fandach was completely wasted and wallowing in sorrow, with his eyes hazy and his tears glistening, making him appear as heartbroken as could be. The most pitiful thing was that he still maintained some cognition despite drinking so much, unable to forget his pains and sorrows. This couldn't be helped. Drinking wine wouldn't always wash away one's sorrows, and it might instead cause one's wounds to burn even more painfully. If one felt increasingly heartbroken and more craving for wine, yearning to dull the pain in one's heart, then one could simply drink oneself to death and piss off. Chen Sancho didn't truly want Chen Pingan to do anything, and he simply wanted an extra person to drink with. Chen Pingan listened to their conversation, allowing him to roughly gauge the situation. Even so, their relationship was very shallow, so Chen Pingan wasn't willing to offer his opinion. Despite becoming drunk and extremely heartbroken, Fandach was still unwilling to criticize Yuchia. Chen Pingan had paid a small amount of attention to Yuchia before. She was a young woman who would never drink until she was drunk, and who possessed a very good disposition. Even though she came from humble beginnings, she exuded a bookish aura, which was very rare among women at the Sword Qi Great Wall. At the same time, she also had a sense of boldness. As for why Chen Pingan had paid attention to Yuchia, this was due to a small action from her that had stuck in his mind. Back then, Chen Sancho, Fandach, and a few others had been sitting together and drinking wine, and they had coincidentally met a sword immortal with whom Yuchia was familiar. Yuchia had stood up to respectfully raise a toast to the sword immortal, and while doing so, she had very naturally reached over to touch the sword immortal's arm. A very brief and normal motion that even Chen Pingan didn't find disrespectful. The male sword immortal hadn't thought anything of the contact either. However, Chen Pingan remembered this interaction very clearly for some reason, most likely because of his experiences in the majestic world, where young women with elegant dispositions and eloquent speech were greatly appreciated by men as they sat on wine tables of varying sizes. This definitely wasn't to say that Yuchia was some kind of promiscuous person, and quite the contrary, Chen Pingan felt like she struck a very good balance when it came to dealing with these social interactions. Disregarding whether Chen Pingan accepted this or not, he could ultimately understand it. The path of cultivation encompassed all aspects of life, and each person had their own method of establishing themselves and finding purpose. Many words and actions, and a lot of hard work that others couldn't see, would become a multitude of life-saving shields that some people quietly earned for themselves. However, Fandach clearly didn't understand this, and perhaps he had never given this proper thought either. In his eyes, perhaps the girl whom he liked had always been this sensible and mindful. At the end of the day, Fandach was undoubtedly head over heels for Yuchia, but he didn't necessarily understand what she liked, nor did he understand her challenges in life. Listening to Fandach's drunken words, he had been utterly confused when hearing that Yuchia wanted to break up with him. He had asked her what he had done wrong, promising that he could change in the future. Yuchia hadn't budged, adamantly stating that the two of them weren't suitable for each other. Thus, of Fandach's many drunken words today, one line was repeated again and again. How are we not suitable for each other? Why have you only discovered today that we're not suitable for each other? Chen Pingan, you're not allowed to think that Yuchia is a bad person. You're definitely not allowed to think that. Fandach suddenly shouted. All right, Chen Pingan replied with a nod. Fan Dach raised his wine bowl and downed half of its contents in a single gulp, with the other half spilling out of the bowl. His eyes appeared lifeless as he looked at Chen Pingan, who was sitting beside Chen Sanxiu, and he asked in a shaky voice, "Tell me, what did I do wrong? Why has Yu Chia decided to marry someone else so quickly? Are nice people truly destined to suffer when it comes to love and relationships? Is it simply because that bastard is better at flattering her and pleasing her? I treated her with absolute sincerity, completely opening my heart up to her, so how was I any worse? My clan is stricter and relatively poorer, but every time she took a fancy to something, did I not buy it for her even if I needed to borrow money from Sanxiu?" Fan Dach paused for a moment before asking, "Chen Pingan, you're an outsider, and those unrelated to the situation can see things more clearly. Where in the world did I go wrong? Was she aware of you borrowing money from Chen Sanxiu?" Chen Pingan asked. Fan Dach faltered for a moment before fuming. "How the fuck would I know whether she was aware of this or not? If I knew, then Yu Chia should still be sitting beside me right now. Anyway, what difference does it make whether I knew this or not? Yu Chia should be sitting beside me and drinking together with me. She should be drinking together with me." His voice grew weaker and weaker, carrying nothing but grief and sorrow in the end. Chen Pingan took a sip of wine and put down his wine bowl, asking in a quiet voice, "Does it truly not make a difference whether she knew about this or not?" Fan Dach suddenly raised his voice and snapped, "Stop rubbing it in, Chen Pingan. It's easy for you to sit there and judge me. You like Ningyao, and Ningyao also likes you, so immortal couples like you are completely oblivious to the challenges of normal relationships." Chen Sanxiu was just about to warn Fan Dach against speaking in such an uncouth manner, but Chen Pingan lightly placed a hand on his elbow and shook his head, signaling to Chen Sanxiu that it was okay. Chen Pingan didn't say anything else as he continued to drink in silence. However, as if finally finding a way to ease his anguish, Fan Dach started to target Chen Pingan with his nonsensical insults. Thankfully, he only focused on matters relating to love and relationships. Chen Sanxiu's expression was livid, and even Dai Zhang's brows were knitted in a deep frown, with the latter considering whether she should knock Fan Dach unconscious with a single punch and be done with it. Chen Pingan remained calm and unfazed the entire time. Fan Dach finally finished blabbering the insults that even he knew were unreasonable, after which he started to loudly bawl his eyes out. Only at this moment did Chen Pingan say, "It was your own fault that she left, so stop finding excuses for yourself, blaming yourself for being too nice, lamenting that it's wrong to be deeply in love, and complaining that being gentle and kind is inferior to having a glib tongue or whatnot. Just admit it if your judgment was poor. When it comes to liking other people, many people also like themselves at the same time, drunk with narcissism and shedding tears for their own sake. These people are oblivious to their own blindness, having no clue what their lovers are thinking, and not even knowing whether these lovers are worthy of their time and sacrifice. Indeed, these people are so blind that they would rather move themselves to tears first." Fan Dach slammed his palm onto the table and roared, "Shut the fuck up! And after these people get hurt, they start to drink wine and find excuses for themselves, saying that the sincerity of good people isn't worth a single copper coin." Chen Pingan continued in a calm voice. "Unfortunately for you, Fan Dach, your clan and powerful background still exist, so you're unable to make more excuses and appear more pitiful, making it appear as if she left you due to your lack of money. As for whether you can take responsibility for yourself in the relationship, with this being the cornerstone of you being able to take responsibility for your lover, is there any need to think about this? I reckon not. You're completely heartbroken. So how can you move yourself to tears if you stop to consider whether you did something wrong?" Fan Dach shakily stood up, with his face contorted and his eyes bloodshot as he shouted, "Do you want to fight, Chen Pingan?" Chen Pingan waved a hand and replied, "No, I'll pass. I'm only speaking these unpleasant truths because you're Chen Sanxiu's friend." He then downed the contents of his wine bowl before filling it up, downing it once again and saying, "If I've said too much, then you can just treat it as the musings of a drunk person. You have my apologies if that's the case." Fan Dach laughed loudly and said, "I'm surely not worthy of an apology from you, Chen Pingan." His two other friends were also extremely displeased with Chen Pingan's behavior. Was this any way to persuade someone? Was he not adding fuel to the fire? Fan Dach glowered intently at Chen Pingan and interrogated, "Just how many things have you experienced? Do you have the right to talk about these grand principles? That's enough. Stop with your drunken antics. Chen Sancho snapped at Fan Dach. There was a tragic expression on Fan Dach's face as he stumbled forward and steadied himself with much difficulty, and he sobbed, Sancho. Chen Sancho sighed and stood up, saying, Let's leave it at this. I'll grab the bill. Chen Pingan shot an apologetic look at Chen Sancho, to which Chen Sancho smiled and nodded in acknowledgement. Chen Pingan left the table and walked toward Daizhong. Fan Dach suddenly raised his wine bowl and swung it at Chen Pingan. Chen Pingan slowed down but didn't turn around, and Chen Sancho immediately made his way around the table and wrapped his arms around Fan Dach, exclaiming in anger, Fan Dach, has the wine washed away your brain? Daizhong was just about to make a move, but Chen Pingan, who had his back to the table, shook his head at her. Regardless of whether a person's feeling of grief was reasonable or not, their feeling of grief would remain real and painful when they were in a despondent state. Fan Dach struggled to break free with all his might, not forgetting to scream at the back of that young man in azure. Chen Pingan, just who do you think you are? You don't understand Yu Cha at all. I'll never forgive you if you dare to slander her like this. Chen Pingan turned around and replied, We can discuss this when you're sober. Fan Dach accidentally elbowed Chen Sancho's chest, allowing him to break free from the latter's arms. He clenched his hands into fists, and his eyes were bloodshot as he panted loudly and shouted, You can criticize me, but you're not allowed to criticize Yu Cha, not one bit. Chen Pingan looked at him and said, I'm speaking to you in a calm and composed manner not because you're correct, but because I have manners. Daizhong gazed at Chen Pingan's figure. She felt a hint of respect and fear at this moment, similar to what she felt when looking at those lofty sword immortals. Aoyang had said before that they didn't need to be afraid of those senior sword cultivators, who appeared imposing on the surface. Rather, they needed to respect and fear those sword cultivators who appeared very calm and easygoing during normal times. This was because the so-called rough edges of a person's personality weren't like the small stones that slipped into people's shoes and made every step painful, but they were instead like the pebbles in the streams, seemingly smooth and easily manipulated, but able to chip people's teeth when bitten. Chen Sancho was furious at this moment, and he pushed Fan Dach's shoulder and sent him stumbling forward. Go on, hit him. Hit him as hard as you can. I'll count it as my bad luck and accept you back as a good friend if you render yourself crippled and half dead. I'll still carry you home. Fan Dach suddenly stood still, regaining his sense of clarity as if a gust of wind had blown away the effects of the alcohol. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. However, Chen Pingan unexpectedly smiled and said, There's no need to take this too seriously. After all, who hasn't experienced a drunken fit before? Just remember to pay the bill. Chen Sancho felt immense regret. If he had known this earlier, he shouldn't have allowed Fan Dach to invite Chen Pingan over to their table. Right now, he still needed to drag Fan Dach home. He would be done for if Ning Yao learned about this, and it would be anyone's guess whether he could still enter the Ning residence as a guest in the future. Daizhong walked over to Chen Pingan and asked, Are you not angry? Chen Pingan squatted down and picked up the shards of the shattered wine bowl, replying with a smile, Do I need to do something if I'm angry? If that's the case every time then. Daizhong also squatted down to clean up the mess with Chen Pingan, and she looked over in slight curiosity when she realized that he wasn't saying anything else. Chen Pingan smiled and continued, If the person speaking doesn't have ill intentions, then there won't exist any unpleasant remarks in the world. If there does, then that points to a shortcoming in one's cultivation of the heart. Daizhong held back a smile and asked, Then what about the person you punched to death before? To say nothing of that person's ill intentions, did I ever claim that my cultivation of the heart is sufficient? Chen Pingan replied as a matter of fact. After cleaning the shards on the ground, Chen Pingan stood up to clean up the mess on the wine table. Apart from half a pot of unfinished wine, there was also the other pot of unopened wine that Chen Pingan had brought over earlier. However, Chen Sancho and the others were very generous, paying for this pot of wine as well. Chen Pingan's mood improved greatly, and he poured himself a bowl of wine. As for the unopened pot, he planned to bring it back to the Ning residence and give it to Senior Nalan. Shopkeeper Daizhong turned a blind eye to this. Chen Pingan sat at the table and drank wine by himself. 1 year had passed and another year had arrived. The old year out, the new year in, peace and prosperity, year after year. Chen Pingan felt slightly unconscionable as he drank wine and looked at the busy shopkeeper. He swirled the wine pot around, estimating that there were still 2 bowls of wine remaining. The wine bowls at the shop indeed weren't very big. Chen Pingan raised a hand and beckoned Dai Zhang over to drink together, pouring her a bowl of wine after she walked over and sat down. He smiled and said, "I don't come to the wine shop often, so I'll take the opportunity today to say a few things to you. Fandach is only a friend of a friend, and what he wanted to hear today wasn't actually principles or reason. He feels far too depressed, and he needed an outlet to vent his emotions." However, Chen Sancho and the others didn't know what to say specifically because they're Fandach's friends. When buried for a long time, the sweetness and mellowness of aged wine are most intoxicating when suddenly opened. There's a big chance that Fandach will die the next time he travels south to fight, and he'll most likely think that he can live in her heart forever this way. Of course, this is only my speculation, and I always like to think of the worst-case scenario. In any case, I was scolded severely by Fandach for no reason, and he even shattered a bowl of our wine shop. I need to have Chen Sancho pay up for this in the future. You're different, Dai Zhang, and not only are you Ning Yao's friend, but you're my friend as well. So, I'm not going to hold back too much regarding what I say next. Rest assured, I'm not Fandach, so I won't go on a drunken rampage. I can't bear to shatter a wine bowl and lose money either. Dai Zhang replied in a joking manner. How do you feel about sword immortals? Chen Pingan asked directly. Some unleash sword strikes in the distance, while some visit this shop to drink wine. Do you feel the same way about them? Or? Dai Zhang thought for a moment before replying. I feel respect toward them. She hesitated for a moment before adding. This all comes down to fear. I suffered at the hands of some low-level sword cultivators when I was young, and to put things simply, those were very miserable experiences. At that time, those low-level sword cultivators already appeared like lofty immortals in my eyes. You might find this comical, but I couldn't help but shake and go pale whenever I walked past them when I was little. This only improved slightly after I became acquainted with Aoyang. I naturally want to become a sword immortal, and I won't regret it if I die on the path to becoming a sword immortal. Rest assured, from becoming a nascent tier cultivator to becoming a sword immortal, I've already considered what I need to do at each cultivation base. At the very least, I can purchase a large residence many years earlier than planned. This is thanks to you. Chen Pingan raised his wine bowl and drank with Dai Zhang, after which he smiled and said, Okay, I feel like the issue isn't big. You admire the strong, but you can also sympathize with the weak, allowing you to walk a middle path. Not only were Ning Yao and I worried, but Chen Sancho and the others were also worried about you fighting too ferociously in the large-scale battles, caring too little about your own life. There was a misunderstanding between you and Fatty Yen in the past, so he doesn't dare to say too much. As for the others, they're also afraid of saying too much, similar to the situation with Chen Sancho and Fandach. Speaking truthfully, however, don't trivialize the matter of life and death. Don't die if you can avoid it. Forget about it, these types of things are often out of our control. I've gone through the same troubles, so I don't have the right to lecture you. In any case, I'll do the same thing as Fatty Yen and the others the next time we leave the city wall, and I'll strive to take a few extra glances at your back. Come, let's raise a toast to your back, shopkeeper. Dai Zhang raised her wine bowl and lightly touched it with Chen Pingan's before downing its contents. Chen Pingan smiled and said, My next question might be asking for a beating, so you need to promise me this first. I'll still be the second shopkeeper afterward, and we'll still be friends afterward. Dai Zhang smiled and replied, Just ask your question first. Promises are useless, and women reneging on promises is even quicker than men downing wine. Chen Pingan felt slightly exasperated as he asked, You like the Confucian noble scholar who took with him the sword, righteous aura, but do you only like his character, or did you somewhat like his status as a virtuous scholar as well? Do you hope that he can one day bring you out of the Sword Chi Great Wall, and take you to Stalactite Mountain and the majestic world? Dai Zhang blushed slightly, and she nodded in response before replying in a low voice, I liked both aspects of him. I liked his character and demeanor, and I especially liked his bookish aura. He was a virtuous scholar. Just how impressive is that? And he's even become a noble scholar now, so I naturally care about this a lot. In any case, I've always wanted to travel to the majestic world ever since meeting Aoyang and Ningyao, and it would obviously be best if I could do so together with him. Dai Zhang was in high spirits as she continued. If there truly comes a day when he reciprocates my feelings, then I'll travel to the majestic world only when I become a sword immortal. Otherwise, I won't leave the sword Qi Great Wall even if he begs me to. Chen Pingan clicked his tongue in wonder and remarked, "It's difficult to say whether he likes you or not, yet you're already thinking this far ahead?" Dai Zhang took a large swig of wine, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand before replying in exuberance. "Is it illegal to simply think about this?" Chen Pingan hesitated for a moment before saying, "Let me tell you a story. This isn't hearsay, nor is it something I personally witnessed. You can treat this as a story from some book, and after listening to it you can, at the very least, avoid the worst-case scenario. It isn't very useful for much else, and many aspects of this story aren't necessarily relevant to you and that noble scholar." This was a story about a love-struck scholar and a female ghost wearing a wedding dress. Those who had strong emotions would often be weighed down by pain, and those who were love-struck would often be hit with disappointment. Naturally, Chen Pingan didn't hope that Dai Zhang and the noble scholar would suffer such a fate, and he hoped that all of the lovers in the world could ultimately hold hands and enjoy life together. There was a condition to this, of course, that being one didn't blindly fall in love with the wrong person. This blindness didn't just pertain to whether the other person was worthy of one's romantic feelings, but it actually pertained more to one's own understanding. The most pitiful people were those who failed to understand from the beginning to the end why the person whom they loved reciprocated the love in the beginning, yet didn't love them anymore in the end. This was the reason behind Chen Pingan's question to Fan Dach, subtly asking him whether Yu Cha knew about his borrowing money from his friends to buy presents for her. Was Fan Dach aware of her thoughts and mindset? Would he still accept her attitude if he were fully aware? If he did, and if he were able to properly deal with the troublesome branches on this path, then that would be a reflection of his abilities. If Fan Dach were truly unaware and muddle-headed from the beginning to the end, then he definitely wouldn't have become so embarrassed and angry at the wine shop. Indeed, it was abundantly clear that Fan Dach was aware of Yu Cha's knowledge of him borrowing money from Chan Sanqiu, whether he had realized it from the beginning or only realized it much later. Even so, Yu Cha had chosen to accept Fan Dach's effort and sacrifice, continuing to ask him for more. Did Fan Dach truly understand what this signified? Clearly not. Perhaps he had a vague feeling that her actions were wrong and hurtful, but he was ultimately unable to come up with a proper solution. Fan Dach only knew that the two of them would grow further and further apart following their breakup. He drank wine to wash away his sorrows, feeling like he should dig his heart out to show Yu Chao his true feelings. Was it wrong for Fan Dach to unreservedly love a person in this manner? Of course not. How could it be wrong for a man to sincerely love a woman, willing to completely open himself up to her? Delving deeper, however, was it possible for there to truly be no wrong? Being so deeply in love with someone, should a person not first and foremost understand who they were in love with? Chen Pingan was an outsider, but he had immediately seen through Yu Cha's strong ambitions after seeing her from afar 2 times, also noticing how she subtly separated Fan Dach's friends into different categories. She was filled with fighting spirit and lofty ambitions, and simply guaranteeing food and shelter with a wealthy descendant like Fan Dach was far from enough. Yu Cha hoped that she could one day be invited on her own merit to those wine tables that were filled with sword immortals. Not only that, but she definitely wouldn't be satisfied with being a mere accompanying guest at the end of the table. Rather, people definitely needed to voluntarily walk over to respectfully raise a toast to her after she sat down. She would sit up straight and wait for other people to pay respects to her. Chen Pingan didn't like this type of woman, but he definitely didn't detest them either. He simply understood them and respected their choice among the many different paths in the world. Did Fan Dach understand these things? No, he didn't understand them at all. His relationship had fallen apart, but he could perhaps try his luck and find a suitable and like-minded partner in the future, becoming immortal Dao partners with her. If he were unlucky, however, then he would only suffer the same disappointment again. Dai Zhang felt righteous indignation when she heard the story's conclusion, and she asked, was the scholar simply yearning to become a noble scholar of Lakeview Academy and yearning to legitimately marry that female ghost and carry her on an 8-person sedan chair? Chen Pingan nodded and replied, That was always his unwavering ambition, and it was because of this that he was forced to jump into the lake and commit suicide. However, the female ghost mistakenly thought that the scholar had betrayed her deep feelings the entire time. The rims of Dai Zhang's eyes surprisingly became red as she murmured, "How could the ending be like this?" His companions at the Confucian Academy were also scholars, so how could they be so wicked? "Scholars never use swords to attack their foes," Chen Pingan said. "The reason I told you this story is that I want you to think more. The majestic world is vast, and the number of scholars is great, so is it possible for every single one of them to be a good person who lives up to the standards of the sagely scriptures? If that's the case, then would the Sword Qi Great Wall be in this current state?" Dai Zhang looked up at Chen Pingan with a strange expression. "I try my best to understand these matters and think more about everything. I observe more, think more and contemplate more, not for the sake of becoming them, but quite the contrary, for the sake of never becoming like them." Chen Pingan continued with a smile. He raised his wine bowl and said, "If there truly comes a day when the romantic feelings between you and that noble scholar are mutual, and you're also a sword immortal at that time and decide to travel to the majestic world, then you definitely need to invite Ning Yao and me over. I'll help you stay guarded against those scholars who are no better than dogs. No matter if it's that noble scholar's so-called friends, companions, seniors or teachers, it's naturally best if these people are reasonable to deal with. I also trust that the people around him are mainly good. Those who are alike tend to gather together after all. However, it's inevitable for some bad people to slip through the cracks, and I know what kind of repulsive principles they'll spew once they open their mouths. I'm the scholarly sage's final disciple, so when it comes to arguing with other people, I was at least able to learn some of the fundamental essence. What do friends mean? It means that some unpleasant words and mood-killing words have to be said, just like some difficult tasks have to be undertaken. I'm actually praising myself by saying this. Come on, let's drink some wine." It was rare for Dai Zhang to smile so brightly, but her expression quickly became downcast just as she was about to raise her bowl to drink some wine. She shot a glance at her missing arm. "These things won't matter if the feelings between the two of you are genuine. Otherwise, it won't make a difference even if you gain 2 extra arms," Chen Pingan said. Dai Zhang chuckled in irritation and huffed. "Is it a good thing to have 3 arms? You have a point. My shortcoming is not being very good at speaking reason," Chen Pingan replied with a smile. Dai Zhang's mood improved again, and she was just about to touch her wine bowl with Chen Pingan's. However, Chen Pingan suddenly killed the atmosphere again, saying, "In any case, there's no relationship between you and that noble scholar to speak of right now, so don't get too ahead of yourself and daydream about a perfect future. Otherwise, you'll only be setting yourself up for disappointment in the future. At that time, this wine shop will earn boatloads of money from you as you drink to wash away your sorrows, and as the second shopkeeper, this won't sit right with me." Dai Zhang's expression immediately became dark. Chen Pingan sighed with emotion and remarked, "The truth often hurts, and it's difficult to be friends." Dai Zhang suddenly smiled and said, "You've already described both the best-case scenario and the worst-case scenario. Thank you for this." She grabbed the wine pot, and she quickly discovered that there was only a single bowl of wine remaining. Chen Pingan waved his hand and said, "I won't drink any more. Ning Yao is quite strict about these things." Dai Zhang didn't hold back, pouring herself the remaining wine and starting to drink slowly. If a customer hollered for more wine, Dai Zhang would tell them to grab wine or grab food by themselves. This was the good thing about regular customers. There was no need to be too polite with them after becoming familiar. Dai Zhang had been worried about providing insufficient service at the beginning, so she had personally attended to all aspects of the wine shop. It was only after seeing Chen Pingan act like this, chatting and bantering with customers and even asking them to help grab wine and food, yet still managing to keep them happy, that she had emulated him and started to do the same. She looked at Chen Pingan, and she noticed that he was gazing toward the corner of the alley. In the past, he would always spend the majority of his time sitting over there and playing the role of a storyteller. Today, however, the children no longer gathered around the small stool. Dai Zhang knew that Chen Pingan would inevitably feel downcast. Even so, she still didn't fully understand why Chen Pingan cared so much about these matters. Perhaps it was because he had come from an impoverished alley in that small town in the Jewel's small world? Even though he was already an immortal in the eyes of many people, he still had a soft spot for impoverished alleys. However, sword cultivators who grew up in the impoverished alleys of the Sword Chi Great Wall all dreamed about becoming neighbors with those powerful families and wealthy clans, no longer needing to return to the small alleys where roosters crowed and dogs barked. Daizhong also had the same mindset. Chen Pingan said he wouldn't drink anymore, but looking at Daizhong leisurely drinking by herself, he couldn't help but glance at the pot of wine on the table that he planned to give to Senior Nalan. A battle took place in his mind, and Daizhong pretended that she couldn't see anything. To say nothing of the customers finding it extremely difficult to get any benefits from the second shopkeeper. Even she, the shopkeeper, found it extremely difficult. Just when Daizhong thought that Chen Pingan would definitely pay up today, he thought of a brilliant solution and stood up, giddily shuffling over to another table with his wine bowl. After making some small talk with the sword cultivators there, he was able to get himself a bowl of free wine, which he promptly finished drinking. When he returned to Daizhang's table, he surprisingly had half a bowl of wine again. After sitting down, Chen Pingan sighed with emotion and remarked, "They're far too enthusiastic and kind. I couldn't turn down their goodwill, and they wouldn't take no for an answer." "Chen Pingan, you're actually a successful disciple of commercialism, aren't you?" Daizhong asked in an exasperated voice. "There are countless people in the world, and who isn't a business person?" Chen Pingan replied with a smile. Daizhong glanced at Chen Pingan drinking and said in amusement, "You said just then that Ning Yao is quite strict about these things?" Chen Pingan had already enjoyed quite a few bowls of wine today, and he replied with a chuckle, "Am I a lofty fourth-tier qi refiner for nothing? A burst of spiritual energy dissipates the alcohol and astonishes the world." Daizhong chuckled in response, deciding that she would definitely tattle on him to Ning Yao. Chen Pingan looked down the street, thinking to himself that business at the other restaurants and wine shops was truly quite mediocre. When seeing the booming business of the new wine shop before, the owners and attendants of these businesses had all stood outside their front doors to loudly and enthusiastically advertise themselves and attract customers. Yet they couldn't keep this up, could they? Meanwhile, he hadn't even used 100% of his power yet. Daizhong continued to serve the guests after drinking wine. She ultimately couldn't bring herself to act as shamelessly as the second shopkeeper. Chen Pingan slowly sipped his half a bowl of wine. Seeing this, Daizhong directly gave him a pair of chopsticks and a plate of picked vegetables. Chen Pingan sat cross-legged and slowly chipped away at the wine and food. More and more customers arrived, so Chen Pingan returned the table and squatted down on the side of the street. Of course, he didn't forget to take the pot of unopened wine with him. Daizhong glanced at the wine bowl that was almost empty, yet still unfinished after such a long time, and she said with an angry chuckle, "Can you tell me straight if you want me to treat you to some wine?" She couldn't help but feel a little perplexed. He was genuinely willing to offer 2 celestial tools as a marriage gift, yet he was also miserly to such an extreme degree. Ning Yao's eyebrows had been slender and attractive when privately telling Daizhong about this, almost causing Daizhang's heart to flutter as well. Chen Pingan shook his head and said, "You're truly mistaken about my intentions." And thus, he walked over to another table to get half a bowl of wine for free, not forgetting to raise it in front of Daizhong to prove his innocence. Daizhong busily served the customers for a long while, and she discovered that Chen Pingan was still squatting on the side of the street. She couldn't help but walk over and ask, "Is something on your mind?" Chen Pingan shook his head, but he nodded afterward and gazed into the distance, replying, "There are things on my mind, and they're all good things. I always feel like I'm dreaming, and this was especially the case when I saw Fandach." Chen Pingan ate some pickled vegetables and drank a sip of wine, smiling widely as he did so. Daizhong carried a stool over and sat beside him. "Second shopkeeper, don't you dare have any impure thoughts about Miss Daizhong. Although it's not a big deal if you do, and you simply need to treat me to a pot of wine, the 5 snowflake coin variant as hush money," one customer chuckled and said. Chen Pingan raised a middle finger high into the air. Daizhong didn't care about this at all. Indeed, people at the Sword Chi Great Wall genuinely didn't have any reservations about these matters. Daizhong wouldn't feel embarrassed or awkward regardless of how sensitive she was, and feeling these ways would only prove that she had something to hide. Moreover, She had never come across someone more measured than Chen Pingan among those in the same generation. In reality, everyone could see the strong feelings between Chen Pingan and Ning Yao, regardless of whether they were friend or foe. Chen Pingan had traveled a great distance to come here from the majestic world, and this was his second time doing so. Not only that, but he also planned to leave the city wall and fight alongside Ning Yao in the next large-scale battle. Perhaps some people would gossip and spread rumors behind their backs, purposely putting a negative spin on things. However, the large majority of people were clearly aware of the reality. Chen Pingan genuinely drank quite a lot of wine today. If we're conceited and oblivious to the people, the matters and the world around us, then we'll often find it difficult to help ourselves, liberate ourselves, and cherish things when it comes to the joys, sorrows, reunions, and partings around us. Those who are young can learn, and they don't need to be afraid of making mistakes. They can right their wrongs and they can strive to make the good better. What is there to be afraid of? What's scary is that people like Fandach become completely stupefied after a blow to their heart, after which they start to blame the heavens and complain about other people. Do you know why Fandach insisted on inviting me over to drink with him? And insisted on asking for my opinion? Why didn't he ask for the opinions of Chun Sancho and the others? That's because he can live with not coming to this wine shop to drink in the future, but he can't live with losing true friends like Chun Sancho and the others. Upon hearing this, Daizhong asked, "Do you have a terrible impression of Fandach?" Chen Pingan shook his head and replied, "You have it the wrong way around. Judging by how sincere his love for that young woman was, Fandach won't draw hate from other people. It's precisely because of this that I was willing to play the role of the villain and speak the unpleasant truth. Otherwise, would I not know what to say to comfort him? Was I so bored that I provoked him on purpose?" Meticulously examining a person's heart is no comfortable matter. The more meticulous we are, the tougher things will become. However, if this initial discomfort can allow those around us to live better and more peaceful lives, then we'll eventually become more comfortable and relaxed in the end as well. Knowing this, it's very important for us to take responsibility for ourselves first. In this way, treating our opponents with respect and seriousness is also one aspect of taking responsibility for ourselves. Daizhong wholeheartedly agreed with this, but she still said, "All right, I get it. I'll treat you to some wine." Chen Pingan chuckled in speechlessness, putting his chopsticks down beside the plate and walking away with the unopened pot of wine. As he walked, he suddenly turned his gaze toward the city wall, but the strange feeling disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. Chen Pingan didn't think too much about this. Die. Chan Qingdu's brows were knitted in a deep frown as he slowly walked out of his thatched cottage and forcefully stomped his foot, unleashing even more power than when the scholarly sage had visited the Sword Chi Great Wall just then. A figure in white swayed elusively above the city wall. This was an extremely tall woman standing with her back to the north and her face to the south, a sword in one hand. Looking at her wavering figure, Chan Qingdu knew that she couldn't remain here for too long. This allowed him to breathe a sigh of relief. However, an uncharacteristic expression of seriousness and reminiscence appeared on the face of the old great sword immortal, who had already guarded this city wall for 10,000 years. He slowly walked over to the parapet where she was standing and asked in curiosity, "Why have you come here?" "I've come here to visit my master," she replied in a calm voice. Chen Qingdu was stunned into silence for a long time before exclaiming in disbelief, "What?" She then continued, "So you can piss off further, Chen Qingdu." Johnson and Flying Dumplings thoughts. "Momo OMG. Is that big sis sword spirit visiting our boy CPA?" Thankfully, the flow of time had already ground to a halt at the Sword Chi Great Wall, or else the tall woman's words would have shaken the sword hearts of a great many sword immortals. Of course, the nearby Zui Yu and the slightly further hidden official in Dongseng could remain unrestrained, but they were still unable to detect what was going on around Chan Qingdu. If anyone dared to wantonly challenge the barrier erected by Chan Qingdu, that would essentially be an act of challenging the old great sword immortal to a sword duel. Chan Qingdu never went easy on other people, and the number of sword immortals who had died at his hands was more than just the solitary Dong Guanpu from 10 years ago. Only sword immortals were able to witness Chan Qingdu's sword strikes. This wasn't a baseless statement. Chen Qingdu wasn't angered by the tall woman's words at all, and he smiled as he jumped onto the parapet and sat down cross-legged, gazing at the vast expanse of land to the south as he asked, "How did the Confucian temple dare to let you stand here? These sages most certainly won't be oblivious to the consequences. Perhaps the old scholar vouched for you? Indeed, he just made a huge contribution for no compensation to speak of. He's truly willing to use up his merit for the sake of his closing disciple." One was standing on the parapet while the other was sitting, highlighting a clear distinction between their seniority. The tall woman frowned and commented slowly, "Chen Qingdu, your courage has also grown considerably after 10,000 years of cultivation." Chen Qingdu smiled and replied, "It's been a long time since I last spoke with you, senior. This is a rare opportunity, so what does it matter if I'm scolded a bit?" The tall woman had only stood here for a brief moment, yet she had already become aware of some secrets that perhaps even the sages of the three teachings and the many sword immortals were unable to gain knowledge of. She shook her head and said, "How pitiful. Why act like that if you knew things would turn out like this? Do you feel any regret?" Chen Qingdu nodded and replied, "Focusing on just myself, I do indeed have many regrets. Back then, I actually had other paths in front of me, allowing me to be unrestrained amid heaven and earth, perhaps even more than most gods and deities. However, I still brandished my sword and ascended higher, continuing to fight alongside many like-minded people in the human world, pointing my blade at the heavens. Those who died didn't feel any regret, so whether or not I feel regret isn't important at all." Chen Qingdu looked up and asked, "Does senior feel any regret?" The tall woman was leaning against her sword, her palms resting on its hilt. She fell silent for a moment before sidestepping the question and asking, "You wouldn't have missed the 3 wisps of sword chi in his acupoints, would you?" "I noticed some traces, but I didn't dare to believe it," Chen Qingdu replied. "At the same time, I was also worried about this being a profound scheme of the Confucian sect." Chen Qingdu gazed up at the sky, sighing with emotion before continuing. "Prior to that child, just how lofty and peerless were the individuals accompanying you, senior? A sword strike here and a sword strike there, and they could casually leave in their wake a mountain of deity corpses and a trail of shattered blessed lands. Following them, however, the ordinary young boy only possessed the aptitude to become an earth immortal, yet his bridge of immortality was shattered, and he was only a 3rd or 4th tier martial artist at the time. How could I believe my eyes, senior? Even until now, I'm still unable to comprehend why you decided to choose Chen Pingan. So I purposely turned a blind eye to this, waiting for this day to arrive. I hope that the moment I attain enlightenment is when I meet you, and I hope that the last sight before my death is to take another look at those wisps of sword chi." There was a faint smile on Chen Qingdu's face as he put his index finger and middle finger together, lightly drawing them through the air and instantly causing a river of sword chi to light up far in the distance. This wasn't a perfectly straight river. It was instead a winding river, seemingly gazing down at the human world from the heavens. "This is the first sword technique that I learned," Chen Qingdu said with a smile. "Truth be told, the sword cultivators nowadays have murky sword hearts and wavering Dao hearts, with their aptitudes truly inferior to those from our generation. All it took was a single glance for us to identify our great Dao. This sword strike would presumably cause significant commotion if it landed in the savage world close to the Sword Chi Great Wall. For example, was Chen Qingdu going to leave the Sword Chi Great Wall and challenge the entire savage world for the first time after 10,000 years? Are you flaunting these trifling techniques in front of me?" the tall woman asked. "I wouldn't dare to," Chen Qingdu replied with a smile. After saying this, the extremely old man, the old great sword immortal in the eyes of everyone at the Sword Chi Great Wall, finally rediscovered the spirit expected of him, saying, "In any case, this junior sword techniques truly can't be regarded as low-level anymore. I naturally wouldn't have stood a chance if I fought against you 10,000 years ago, senior, but if I get another opportunity to travel against the flow of time and return to the past with my sword, going to that battlefield." The tall woman seemingly didn't move, but her sword was already hovering in the air, with its tip pointing at the seated Chen Qingdu. Chen Qingdu remained upright and unfazed despite the blade being just 3 inches from his head, and he formed a tiny speck of light at the tip of the sword. "Others might not be able to deal with you at the Sword Chi Great Wall, Chen Qingdu, but I'm an exception," the tall woman said. "In the beginning, the sword techniques in the world split into 4 lineages, with Chen Qingdu representing one at the Sword Chi Great Wall, the heavenly masters representing one at Mount Longhu, the Taoist sword immortals representing one at the Mystery Capital Temple, and the Buddhists representing one at the Lotus Flower Buddhist Nation. This was the extremely hidden inheritance of the sword technique orthodoxies over the past 10,000 years, unknown to almost everyone in the world. In fact, many sword immortals from the northern complete reed continent were completely oblivious to this piece of history as well, only knowing that there existed 4 immortal swords in the large worlds. Each of the 4 sword technique lineages had its own focus, but in terms of destructive ability alone, the lineage represented by the sword Qi Great Wall's Chen Qingdu was undisputedly number 1. Chen Qingdu naturally wasn't afraid of the tall woman beside him, someone who was far away from reaching the pinnacle of the sword Dao. Rather, he simply respected her. This was a feeling of respect even greater than heaven and earth. However, even though he didn't fear her, how could he truly not feel worried at all? Just like she had mentioned, if they disregarded combat power and cultivation base for the moment, Chen Qingdu's sword techniques would never be the loftiest in front of her, regardless of how lofty they were. This remark from her was actually even more astonishing than her quip for Chen Qingdu to piss off. One had to realize that Chen Qingdu would legitimately be peerless at the sword Qi Great Wall, unless the sages of the 3 teachings personally visited the Great Wall with the tokens of their teachings. Even the Taoist second disciple, armed with an immortal sword, would stand no chance against Chen Qingdu. Why did Stalactite Mountain exist? Why was there a catch and release pavilion at Stalactite Mountain? The Taoist second disciple had already arrived at Stalactite Mountain back then, so why hadn't he taken another step forward? He was someone who liked to battle against heaven and earth, so why had he visited the majestic world with an immortal sword, yet returned to the heavenly world without unleashing a single sword strike? After all, the Taoist second disciple's initial intention had been to stand on the largest mountain seal in the world and engage in an all-out battle against the sword Qi Great Wall's Chen Qingdu. He wanted to prove that not only was his Tao power profound, hence half of the white jade capital being crafted by his hands, but his sword techniques had also opened a new chapter for the world, establishing a 5th lineage of sword technique orthodoxy. In the end, however, the Taoist second disciple ultimately didn't unleash a sword strike in his first and only visit to the majestic world. The tall woman and Chen Qingdu both gazed into the distance, with the former never sparing so much as a single glance for the latter. Looking at the southern wall of the sword Qi Great Wall, dust started to rustle and fall from the strokes that made up the humongous characters. Some of the Earth Immortal sword cultivators over there swayed back and forth as a result, yet they didn't notice this at all. "Senior, this is enough, no?" Chen Qingdu asked with a faint smile. "Are you aware that your inaction back then caused my master's cultivation speed to become significantly slower? He should have overcome the barriers of the sword Qi 18 stops technique a long time ago," the tall woman replied. "Is it a big deal for young people to progress more slowly and face some additional hardships?" Chen Qingdu asked. "Progressing too fast, ascending to the pinnacle too early, and having your company as well, won't necessarily be a good thing for the world." Suiyu's comments to Wei Jin about wielding a sword were absolutely spot on, and he should explain this same concept to his junior brother. If Chen Pingan is unable to truly become your master, then my opinion is that he should walk even slower on the path of cultivation. It's best that he's never able to wield a sword, and the slower he reaches the pinnacle, the better. If he one day becomes fond of unleashing sword strikes on a whim, then I'll truly regret ever letting him enter the lotus flower blessed land to train and temper himself, giving him an opportunity to rebuild his bridge of immortality. If I remember correctly, that blessed land borders a small world that was shattered by your emanating sword Qi when you killed a genuine deity back then? Yes, senior? The tall woman didn't offer a response. The tiny speck of light on the tip of her sword suddenly expanded to the size of a fist, causing Chen Qingdu's hair to slowly float and sway in the air. Some strands of his hair were severed, carried away by the wind, and astonishingly sliced apart the frozen river of time with ease. "Chen Qingdu, I'm giving you face, so you need to cherish this leniency." Her expression was cold, and the depths of her eyes housed a radiance even brighter than the sun and the moon. "My previous master from 10,000 years ago felt pity for you people, the ants on the ground, and you people accepted their pity. 10,000 years later, I've already fallen significantly, while your sword Dao has risen several notches. However, this is no excuse for you to speak to me like this. The old scholar was alarmed and anxious while taking me here, and he told me a whole load of nonsense. This wasn't without reason. Chen Qingdu smiled bitterly and asked, "The old scholar didn't tell you about the marriage proposal, did he? Are you squabbling with me because of this? That old man is truly miserly. He's never willing to accept even the smallest of losses." He reached over and grabbed the orb of light on the sword tip, continuing, "I can't offer any more than this. Senior, you can feel free to take this pure sword intent, and you can treat this as compensation for me delaying the tempering of your sword." The tall woman frowned and withdrew her sword, with the orb of light instantly disappearing from its tip and slowly flowing through the blade. She once again rested her hands on the hilt and leaned against the sword like before. Chen Qingdu turned around and asked with a smile, "What do you think when looking at the human world again?" "It's too small," the tall woman replied coldly. Chen Qingdu nodded and concurred. "Indeed. Even the sun, the moon, and the stars lost their radiance before your sword light in the past. Or to be more precise, it was your existence that created the dazzling galaxies we see now. The tens of thousands of stars in the sky were all floating corpses." Chen Qingdu stood up, hunchbacked as if he were unable to withstand the weight, unable to truly straighten his back throughout the past 10,000 years. Apart from a small number of great sword immortals, all of the sword cultivators in the world had already become oblivious to the fact that, looking back to the foundation, all of the sword techniques in the world originated from the heavens. It was from those fundamental sword techniques that tens of thousands of mystical abilities had sprouted, struck by swords from the human world, and knocked to the ground alongside the many deities. These mystical abilities were then collected by the measly humans who had initially lived a life of struggle, allowing them to cultivate and become immortals atop the mountains. Initially, puppets raised as livestock by the many deities, lowly puppets to offer incense, these measly humans gradually transformed themselves and became rulers of the world. That was an extremely long and arduous process. Chen Qingdu was one of the first people to learn sword techniques in the world, making him one of the most experienced founders of sword cultivation, and eventually allowing him to open the heavens with the others. Why were swords the way they were? And why did sword cultivators possess the greatest destructive ability, even surpassing heaven and earth? These were the reasons. During the late stages of that earth-shattering Great War, however, disagreement and conflict flared up among the humans, resulting in the sword cultivators becoming prisoners who were exiled to the Sword Qi Great Wall. At the same time, the demon tribe was also exiled to the desolate land of barbarians. Afterward, the majestic world established the Confucian Temple in the Middle Earth Divine Continent, and constructed the 9 mighty suppressing pagodas that towered between heaven and earth. The young Taoist priest riding atop the ox had traveled far to the heavenly world, building the white jade capital as his base. Meanwhile, Buddha had trodden upon lotus flowers and allowed his divine light to grace the vast lands. Compared to this, was the extermination of flood dragons 8,000 years ago not just a measly matter? Why were you willing to choose that child, senior? Chen Qingdu asked in a quiet voice. Qi Jingchun said that a 1 in a million chance for some people is a certainty, so he told me to give this a try, the tall woman replied. Have you been disappointed again? Chen Qingdu asked. The tall woman casually raised her sword and thrust forward, piercing Chen Qingdu's head. Golden light poured from her sword, appearing like a small Milky Way hovering in the human world. Chen Qingdu remained unfazed and unmoving, simply sighing with emotion and remarking, "Senior, your temper is still as bad as always." "It's already improved a lot," the tall woman replied. Chen Qingdu shifted several steps to the side, avoiding her sword as he smiled and asked, "Then why did you split apart Stalactite Mountain with a single slash before?" If it weren't for the second sage personally stopping her and appearing at the Confucian Temple in a rare display, then Stalactite Mountain might have already collapsed and ceased to exist a long time ago. Master was unconscious at the time, so I was able to act as I pleased, the tall woman responded. I would have never imagined that your master would be Chen Pingan, Chen Qingdu said in helplessness. Thinking about this a bit more, however, no one else seems to be more suitable. If it were anyone else, it would be difficult to say whether they were the master or you were the master. Chen Qingdu suddenly chuckled and remarked, "Just how divine was Qi Jingchuan's final move on the Go board?" The tall woman made a casual grabbing motion, drawing the golden light from her sword and regathering it into a dazzling orb of light that landed in her palm. She casually squeezed down, shattering the orb and saying with a cold chuckle, "Offering me sword intent? From you, Chen Pingan." Chen Pingan smiled and nodded in response. The tall woman held her index finger and middle finger together, saying with a faint smile, "I'll extract it myself." Specks of golden light started to materialize around the entire sword chi great wall. Chen Pingan's expression changed slightly, and he heaved a soft sigh. He could stop her if he truly wanted to, but the price to pay would be far too great. In any case, he genuinely didn't understand her temperament right now, so he could only use his trump card. And thus, the young man in azure who had shaken away the effects of the alcohol and was just about to arrive at the Ning residence, suddenly turned around and stumbled his way to the city wall, arriving beside the tall woman. There was puzzlement and delight on Chen Pingan's face as he exclaimed in a soft voice, "Big sister immortal?" The tall woman flicked her sleeve and caused the specks of golden light to disperse, with the sword in her hand also vanishing from sight. She turned around and smiled, pulling Chen Pingan into an embrace. Chen Pingan was slightly flustered, and he spread his arms and turned around to look at Chen Pingan with an innocent expression. However, the tall woman placed a hand on his head and pulled it forward. Chen Pingan closed his eyes and opened them again. No, he truly wasn't seeing things. The old great sword immortal reached up and massaged his temples. The sword strike from before naturally hurt. Chen Pingan flushed beet red. The tall woman had thankfully let go of him already, and she bent down slightly to gaze at him. She smiled widely and said in a gentle voice, "Master, you have grown taller again." Seeing her reach over again, Chen Pingan hurriedly extended his hands and lightly placed them on her arms, saying with a bitter smile, "I'm dead meat if Ning Yao sees this." There was a tragic expression on the tall woman's face as she clutched her heart and asked, "Are you not afraid of me dying of heartbreak first?" There was a peculiar glimmer in Chen Pingan's eyes as he smiled widely and gazed up at the sky. He raised his arm, pointing at the 3 moons as he asked, "Big sister immortal, I've heard that this world will be fine even if 2 of the 3 moons go missing. The cycle of the 4 seasons will continue as normal, and the growth of all matters will progress without impediment. That being the case, can we perhaps hack one of the moons down to take home in the future? For example, we can secretly place a moon inside the lotus root blessed land." The tall woman looked up and replied with a faint smile, "This isn't possible right now, but it won't be difficult in the future." Chen Pingan was almost stifled to death as he stood beside them and listened on. The tall woman shot a sideways glance at him, and the old great sword immortal took his leave upon seeing this. Before leaving, however, Chen Pingan said in a seemingly casual manner, "Rest assured, I won't tell little Ning about this." Chen Pingan turned around and said with a limpid gaze, "I'll tell her myself." The tall woman continued to smile widely as she stood beside Chen Pingan. However, 3 words instantly exploded in Chen Pingan's mind's lake. "Fuck off further." Chen Pingan clasped his hands behind his back as he slowly walked away. Chen Pingan placed his hands inside his opposite sleeves as he walked alongside the sword spirit. He was extremely familiar with the River of Time, so not only did he not feel uncomfortable as he walked along it, but he even took to it like a fish in water. His shuddering soul wasn't an issue at all. If he didn't care about face, and if the sword spirit weren't present, he could have easily sprinted along the River of Time. After all, it was an incredibly rare opportunity to enter a frozen River of Time and reap its corresponding benefits. He turned around and asked with a smile, "Why have you come here? Did my master visit the Dragon Spring Prefecture?" The sword spirit nodded in response. The old scholar was still worried about the safety of his closing disciple at the Sword Chi Great Wall. Of course, he had also said frankly to her that so be it if Chen Pingan, that old geezer, didn't give him face, but how could he not give Chen Pingan's master face? Was this acceptable? Was this not the same as refusing to give face to his disciple, who was also her master? Who gave Chen Pingan such wanton courage? "I initially thought I could only see you again after a few decades," Chen Pingan said. Regarding the matter of sharpening the sword, the dragon-slaying platform at the Wind Snow Temple has already been completely consumed, the sword spirit said with a smile. "Rest assured, master, I still spoke reason with them." The Wind Snow Temple was absolutely terrified when they noticed something amiss in the beginning, and none of the sword cultivators guarding the dragon-slaying platform dared to act rashly. Afterward, a baby-faced little child secretly made his way to Dragonspine Mountain and adhered to all of the etiquette, so I decided to see him and teach him a sword technique as compensation for the Wind Snow Temple. The little child was quite happy, especially since this sword technique could help him advance his cultivation base. Following this was Ruanqiong's dragon-slaying platform, and he also agreed to my request. It's because of this that the Great Li Empire is especially choosing another site for the Dragon Spring Sword sect now. Ruanqiong was fairly smart and didn't make any requests, so I became happy and taught him a sword forging technique. Otherwise, his dreams and ambitions would have been nothing but just that with his crappy cultivation base. As for the dragon-slaying platform owned by True Martial Mountain, it's best to forget about that. It has far too many ties and implications, and touching it could easily cause trouble. I don't mind trouble at all, but it would have caused a huge headache for you, Master. There were some things she wasn't incapable of doing, but, as with Chen Qingdu's concern about the master-subordinate dynamic involving her, she was also worried about causing trouble for Chen Pingan. Chen Qingdu had genuinely raised some good points, but she simply felt like a measly Chen Qingdu didn't have the right to lecture her. Chen Pingan held his hands inside his opposite sleeves and said in a calm voice, "There will eventually come a day when troubles are nothing more than measly troubles for me." The sword spirit was extremely happy. There were many twists and turns, and she had initially thought that their affinity would drift further and further apart, eventually leaving a huge chasm between them. She wouldn't necessarily have felt disappointed, but she would have somewhat felt that the situation was a pity. In the end, however, he unexpectedly matched her ideal image, and became the perfect person to wield the sword. "What kind of person do you want to become if you are able to keep ascending higher, Master?" the sword spirit asked with a smile. "Someone who speaks with reason and someone who acts with principle," Chen Pingan replied without hesitation. "And when I launch a sword strike beyond the heavens and throw a punch toward the earth, all of the martial artists in the world will feel like divine might has been unleashed." "Why must you live for the sake of other people?" the sword spirit asked with a sigh. When it came to practicing martial arts and training fist techniques, Cui Cheng's influence on Chen Pingan was unfathomably big. Half of his remark just then clearly resonated with the deceased Cui Cheng. It was a solemn promise, one that linked the two of them despite the barrier of life and death. Chen Pingan shook his head and explained, "This isn't the case. I've always been living for myself, but I'll inevitably develop relationships and find things I care about as I walk along this path. Those whom I respect should live eternally in my heart, and even if the world forgets them, they'll still live on in my memory. If the opportunity arises, I'll even strive to reawaken the world's memory of these people." The sword spirit fell deep into thought, recalling some matters from long, long ago. After walking for a while, Chen Pingan turned around and retraced his steps. The sword spirit also turned around and retraced her steps. This was the path of no wrong that Chen Pingan pursued, preventing the sword spirit from traveling too broadly along the river of time and potentially triggering unexpected consequences. There were far too many surprises and accidents in the world, with people powerless to stop them. They could only accept their fates. But at the very least, Chen Pingan would avoid causing too many surprises and accidents due to his own carelessness. Mr. Qi knew Chen Pingan the best, yet he had already passed away because of Chen Pingan. The sword spirit and Chen Pingan sat on the parapet, just like they had sat on the Golden Arch Bridge in the past. "Are you about to leave?" Chen Pingan asked. "I can stay, but the old scholar who's waiting painfully at Stalactite Mountain might have to visit the Confucian Temple to apologize," the sword spirit replied. "A brief parting is no issue, but please don't leave without ever returning again. I might be able to stand this, but I'll inevitably feel very distressed. Yet, I won't be able to say anything, and I can only suffer distress in silence," Chen Pingan said. "Master, you and I shall share life and death for eternity," the sword spirit said with a smile. Chen Pingan turned around and extended a palm. The sword spirit raised her hand, not high-fiving Chen Pingan, but instead holding his hand and giving it a gentle shake. "This is the second promise between us." Chen Pingan smiled and nodded. "I'll definitely honor my promises." The sword spirit retracted her hand and lightly tapped her knees, gazing at the barren lands of the savage world as she said with a cold chuckle, "There appear to be a few undying old friends still. Then I'll take extra caution, Chen Pingan said. If I appear, then these sneaky primordial beings won't dare to kill you. At most, they'll only dare to shatter your bridge of immortality again, forcing you to step onto an ancient path with me, the sword spirit said. Chen Pingan shook his head and replied, regardless of what I'll think in the future and whether I'll change my mind or not, I most definitely won't leave at this moment. Okay, the sword spirit said with a smile. Do you know what's most impressive about me? Chen Pingan suddenly asked, smiling. The sword spirit thought about this for a moment before replying. You dare to make trade-offs. For example, Chen Pingan had made a trade-off between her and Ning Yao when he had unleashed a sword strike toward Tassel Mountain in the old scholar's picture scroll. If he had chosen incorrectly, then things would have progressed in a drastically different direction. A person who acted obsequiously toward so-called power and influence didn't deserve to unleash a sword strike toward the heavens in her stead. 10,000 years had passed, and how many people in the human world had buckled at the knees and gone weak in the back? Countless. These people truly needed to take a look at how their ancestors had struggled through difficult times and climbed to greater heights with their swords, courting death for the sake of creating a better world for future generations. Following the heroic death of this generation, however, the radiance of humanity, which was vastly different from that of divinity, also started to change. More accurately, it was covered. The gods and deities had crafted these ants in the past, and they were regarded as ants because of their innate shortcomings, which pertained to more than just their short lifespan. It was precisely because of these shortcomings that the lofty gods in the heavens had viewed the humans as measly ants who could never rebel, only being able to offer endless amounts of incense to them for all eternity. Their lives were completely worthless. At that time, some of the lofty gods peering down at the world had noticed the transformations in the humans. However, they were reaping unimaginable benefits through forming and tempering their godly bodies using incense offerings from the human world, something that was linked to the foundation of their longevity. So some of the gods turned a blind eye to changes in the human world. They wanted to maintain the status quo and continue to draw on the bottomless source of power. Meanwhile, some of the gods thought nothing of this transformation, convinced that they could crush these measly ants with ease if they wanted to. Reality had ultimately proven otherwise, propelled by many so-called coincidental inevitabilities. For example, the conflict between fire and water. Most unexpected of all was the fact that her previous master, as well as a few deities, had been willing to regard a small handful of people as genuinely like-minded individuals. That was the catalyst behind the growth of sword techniques, and a myriad of other techniques in the human world. Chen Pingan shook his head and said in a soft voice, "My heart is free." He then smiled and continued, "People didn't say this in the past because they had never even considered it before." She then repeated the 4 words spoken by Chen Pingan. "My heart is free," she murmured. Die. The old great sword immortal tossed Chen Pingan back inside the city. Nailan Yeshing was already waiting at the entrance, and the two of them entered the Ning residence together, with Nailan Yeshing asking in a quiet voice, "Did the old great sword immortal drag you over?" Chen Pingan nodded in response, not saying anything else. Nailan Yeshing hadn't been especially worried to begin with, and he felt even more at ease after learning that it was indeed the old great sword immortal's doing. However, Chen Pingan used his mind's lake to say, "Grandpa Nailan, can you please pass on a message to Grandma Bai? I have some matters to discuss with her at the Minute Small World." "A meeting with young mistress?" Nailan Yeshing asked with a serious expression. "Yes, together," Chen Pingan replied with a smile. The 4 of them convened at the training ground. Chen Pingan roughly explained the situation regarding the sword spirit, only giving a general overview of the current situation, and not touching upon the more fundamental matters. Nailan Yeshing and Bai Lianshuang exchanged glances with each other, as if they were listening to something unfathomable. A true spirit nurtured and born from an immortal sword? One of the 4 legendary immortal swords that had possessed the greatest destructive power 10,000 years ago. A true spirit that could be regarded as an old friend of old great sword immortal Chan Qingdu? Ning Yao fared okay, with her expression remaining calm and unfazed. A ripple appeared at the training ground, from which a tall woman in white stepped out and stood beside Chen Pingan. She looked around before eventually settling her gaze on Ning Yao. Ning Yao raised an eyebrow. "Rest assured, I'm going to leave very soon." the sword spirit said with a smile. And so what if you don't leave? Ning Yao asked. The sword spirit looked at Ning Yao's glabella and remarked with a faint smile, "That's fairly interesting. You're worthy of my master." Chen Pingan knew that things were about to go south, and sure enough, Ning Yao chuckled coldly and said, "And would I be unworthy if I didn't possess that? Does your opinion matter regarding whether I'm worthy or not?" Beads of sweat formed on Nalin Yeshing's forehead. Bai Lianshuang was also tense with anxiety. The sword spirit smiled and replied, "No, it doesn't matter at all." "Happy?" Ning Yao replied with a cold chuckle. Chen Pingan looked down and kept quiet, unable to use any of his abilities at this moment. Even speaking a single word would be wrong. "All right, I'm going to leave now," the sword spirit said with a yawn. Her figure, which was already shimmering and unstable to begin with, gradually faded away, eventually breaking through the sky of the Sword Qi Great Wall under Chan Qingdu's escort. After arriving at the majestic world, the old scholar helped to conceal her aura as they traveled to the eastern treasured Vile continent. As they traveled, the old scholar smiled and asked, "How was it?" "She's not exactly a very beautiful girl," the sword spirit replied. The old scholar rubbed his hands together and said with an awkward expression, "I wasn't asking about that." "Oh, you were asking about Chen Qingdu? It's been 10,000 years, so our brief chat and reminiscence went quite well," the tall woman responded. The old scholar scrunched up his face, feeling like now was not a suitable time to ask too many questions. The sword spirit glanced down at Stalactite Mountain and said casually, "Chen Qingdu has agreed to let one more person through, to make a total of 3 people. You can satisfy the Confucian Temple's request now." "What? Senior, your lofty status was only worth 1 additional person." The old scholar fumed. "Is Chen Qingdu trying to revolt? What utter impudence! I can instruct Chen Qingdu not to let a single person through. That way my lofty status will be worth 4 people, no?" The sword spirit replied. "How can I possibly ask you to travel to the Sword Qi Great Wall again, senior?" The old scholar said in a righteous voice. 3 people is also fine. Chen Qingdu might be stingy, but righteous scholars like me still need to uphold propriety, righteousness, integrity, and a sense of shame. The sword spirit looked down again, glancing at the flood dragon trench. The old scholar also glanced down and he huffed, "I say we forget about them. There are only some small fry left." A streak of white light and a puff of azure smoke disappeared in a flash, instantly traveling thousands of kilometers on the way from Stalactite Mountain to the eastern treasured Vile continent. To say nothing of sword immortals soaring through the skies on their swords, even intercontinental messenger flying swords couldn't travel at such an astonishing speed. The sword spirit raised a hand and moved her fingers slightly. The old scholar craned his neck and glanced over, feeling slightly uneasy as he asked in an uncertain voice, "What are you doing?" "Recording things," the sword spirit replied in an apathetic voice. "Recording what?" the old scholar asked carefully. "Recording the crimes of Lu Chen? Or recording the crimes of that stinky Taoist priest from the observing Tao temple?" "Recording how many times you call me senior," the sword spirit replied with a faint smile. "How could you do that?" the old scholar exclaimed in a pained voice. "I'm not very old, but have I ever cared about other old geezers referring to me as an old scholar? Referring to others as senior is out of respect, while referring to me as an old scholar or impoverished scholar is something of a joke. How many people respectfully refer to me as the scholarly sage? Who can I vent my pain and frustration to?" The sword spirit retracted her hand and glanced down at the sect located in the sea, the one with both a deity statue representing a formal rain god and a divine general statue representing an official of the heavenly court's northern heavenly gate, asking, "How has Bai Zhe chosen?" The old scholar smiled and replied, "He made a good choice, saying that he wanted to wait for a while longer." "And the resulting merit from this choice?" the sword spirit asked. "It won't count." "How can it count and who can it count towards?" "He's no longer with us," the old scholar said with a shake of his head. "Scholars are quite good at keeping tabs and accounts," the sword spirit commented with a snicker. The old scholar nodded and concurred. "You're right about that. It's quite mentally tiring, to be honest with you." The sword spirit turned around and said, "No, something's not right." The old scholar huffed and said, It was too risky for you to go to the Sword Chi Great Wall. I suggested that I could make a promise with my life, but those bloody criminals at the Confucian Temple refused to accept my proposal, no matter what. As a result, a portion of merit that should have belonged to my closing disciple was used up. There are few generous scholars belonging to the lineage of the second sage, and all of them are as miserly as can be. Can stingy sages be regarded as true sages? If my divine statue were still enshrined at the Confucian Temple, standing there in boredom with the old geezers, then I would have expounded some reason to the crappy lineage of the second sage a long time ago. I guess this is all my fault. Back when I was still respected and revered, those at the Confucian schools and academies tried everything they could to invite me over to give lectures. However, I was thin-skinned and liked to put on airs, so I didn't give anywhere near as many lectures as I should have. Otherwise, if I had visited more of those schools and academies back then, little Pingan would have many more seniors who weren't technically senior brothers, but perhaps even better than senior brothers. The sword spirit was surprisingly unfazed about the old scholar using up her master's merit. It appeared as if this action suited her tastes. As for the old scholar's remark about making a promise with his life, she couldn't help but feel embarrassed by his shamelessness. The impoverished scholar was unlike a human, unlike a ghost, and unlike a deity, and was he not aware of this awkward situation himself? Who in the majestic world was capable of killing him now? The paramount sage definitely wouldn't make a move, and the same was true for the etiquette sage. Meanwhile, the battle between the second sage and the scholarly sage only pertained to their great Tao, and it had absolutely nothing to do with any private grievances. The old scholar nodded to himself and continued, "It would have been a waste not to use this merit, and the earlier it's used up, the better, lest my disciple feel upset after learning of its existence. Being entangled with this merit wasn't a good thing to begin with. I'm not trying to boast or anything, but those belonging to my lineage are all ambitious and knowledgeable, possessing exemplary characters and displaying great generosity. Little Pingan has visited 3 continents and traveled far and wide, yet he hasn't visited a single Confucian academy. This is a clear reflection of his attitude toward our scholarly temples, schools, and academies. He feels frustration and anger in his heart, and I view this as a very good thing. This is the way it should be." "What about Chui Chan?" the sword spirit asked with a smile. "Have I ever taken this person as my disciple before? I only recall having a grand disciple by the name of Chui Dongshan," the old scholar replied with a baffled expression. "I feel like Chui Chan's demeanor is the closest to those human ancestors," the sword spirit stated. "Who said it wasn't?" the old scholar replied with an adrift look. He paused for a moment before murmuring, "I also made mistakes, but it's a shame that I no longer have the opportunity to right my wrongs. This is life. The ability to identify mistakes and make positive changes is a great virtue. The ability to identify mistakes but not have the opportunity to make changes is a great regret, a great pain." However, the old scholar quickly wiped away the dark fog in his mind, tugging at his beard as he smiled. The past couldn't be chased, but the future could be pursued. Indeed, hadn't he found himself a closing disciple? Senior? What senior? He was indeed younger, but the two of them possessed the same seniority.